You have got to be pulling my leg." The shrill, panicked voice of Elias Thorne echoed sharply, off the warped wooden planks of the Valley Train Depot, cutting right through the lingering, metallic hiss of the newly arrived locomotive. He stumbled backward, his face draining of color, pointing a trembling, manicured finger up at the colossal woman stepping off the passenger car. Mott sent for a wife, not a circus freak. Lord in heaven, look at the size of her. The crowd of frontier townsfolk, previously bustling about their dusty afternoon business, stopped dead in their tracks. A heavy, suffocating silence gripped the platform. Then, a single cruel chuckle broke the quiet. It spread like a dry brush fire, low and vicious, passing from the blacksmith to the grocer, from the parasol-twirling ladies to the loitering ranch hands, until the entire station erupted into open, pointing, riotous laughter. Bernadette stood entirely frozen on the edge of the platform. She was an awe-inspiring, terrifying sight to the fragile sensibilities of the town. 6'8" of thick, corded muscle and heavy, unbreakable bone. She was wrapped in a faded, oversized canvas work skirt and a worn, sleeveless cotton blouse that stretched dangerously tight across her impossibly broad, sun-darkened shoulders. Her battered leather travel bag slipped from her massive, calloused fingers, hitting the dust with a heavy, defeated thud. The rejection was instantaneous, vicious, and entirely public. She squeezed her hazel eyes shut, instinctively hunching forward, desperately trying to shrink a towering frame built by a lifetime of hauling iron and oak crates on the brutal eastern docks. It was a futile effort. She was a giantess, trapped on a sun-baked stage of pure humiliation, entirely surrounded by jeering, relentless faces. Now, friends, gather close to the fire for a moment. If you have ever felt the harsh, unforgiving sting of the world's mockery, or if you believe that true strength lies in standing as a shield for the vulnerable, then you will understand the heavy weight of this tale. If you find warmth in stories of genuine protection and second chances, feel free to like, subscribe, and share your own thoughts in the comments about what true courage means to you. Because what happened next on that dusty platform changed the course of 2 lonely lifetimes. Bernadette swallowed hard, her throat burning by hot unshed tears and choking prairie dust. Her heart, a deeply tender thing hidden beneath layers of physical armor, cracked straight down the middle. She instinctively folded her massive, heavily scarred hands deep into the worn folds of her canvas skirt, hiding them from the cruel stares. It was a nervous habit, born of a lifetime of being told her hands were meant only for labor, never for holding. She had traded the brutal, bone-grinding exhaustion of the shipping docks for the exact same cruelty out west. The matrimonial advertisement had promised a fresh start, a kind man who simply needed a sturdy, capable woman. Sturdy. It was the tragic, desperate lie she had told herself for weeks across the rattling railway miles. She was not sturdy, she was a titan. And in the eyes of Elias Thorne, who was currently cowering behind a stack of luggage, she was a monster. "Mode ain't he paying the rest of the agency fare?" Elias shrieked, his voice cracking as he addressed the station master. "She's taller than me. She's taller than half the men in this blasted county. Mode ain't he marrying a beast? Look at those shoulders." A woman in the crowd sneered from beneath her lace parasol. She could pull a plow all by herself. More laughter tore through the hot summer air. Bernadette lowered her chin, her broad chest heaving as she prepared to pick up her bag and walk back onto the train. She had no money for a return ticket. She had no destination. She only knew she had to escape the sound of their laughing mouths. But the laughter suddenly faltered. It did not die out of sudden empathy or regret. It died because a massive shadow had just fallen across the sun-bleached wood of the platform. The heavy, rhythmic thud of thick leather boots resonated through the floorboards, drowning out the murmurs. Thud. 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 The crowd parted instantly, practically scrambling over one another to get out of the way. stepping from the shade of the depot's overhanging roof, was Thaddeus. He was the myth of the mountain made flesh, a notoriously reclusive timber carpenter, who rarely descended from the frozen peaks. Standing at 6'6", he was perhaps an inch or two shorter than the towering Bernadette, but he was impossibly, terrifyingly broad, a sheer mountain of a man. His chest was a massive expanse of raw power, barely contained beneath heavy denim trousers, thick leather suspenders, and a torn, sleeveless flannel shirt that revealed arms like mature oak trunks, dusted with fresh sawdust and dried earth. His face was weathered, framed by a thick, dark beard, and his deep, soulful brown eyes burned with a quiet, devastating intensity. He did not yell. He did not reach for the heavy hunting knife strapped to his thigh. He merely walked. The sheer, oppressive weight of his physical presence sucked the air directly out of the station. Elias Thorne took one look at the approaching giant and scrambled backward until his spine hit the brick wall of the ticket office, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Thaddeus ignored the cowardly man entirely. He ignored the whispering town. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a massive predator, his heavy boots coming to a halt just inches away from Bernadette's fallen leather bag. Bernadette flinched, bracing her heavily muscled shoulders. Her breath hitched. Was this massive, terrifying stranger going to physically throw her out of his town? She kept her massive hands hidden in her skirt, her gaze locked firmly on the dusty toes of her boots, awaiting the inevitable blow. Thaddeus shifted his immense weight, the heavy leather of his suspenders creaking loudly in the dead silence of the platform. He did not strike her. He did not laugh. Instead, he stepped directly in front of her, turning his massive back to the crowd. In one simple movement, he placed his colossal frame between her and the jeering town, becoming an immovable, silent shield against their cruelty. The sudden blockade of their stares felt like a rush of cool water over a severe burn. Slowly, Bernadette raised her chin. She looked up, a rare, startling sensation for her, and met the dark, steady eyes of the wild mountain man. The contrast was staggering. He looked like a man who could tear a grizzly bear apart with his bare hands, yet his eyes held an ocean of profound, quiet gentleness. He looked at her weathered, sun-beaten face, sweeping his gaze over her broad, muscular shoulders and her towering height. There was no disgust in his expression. There was no fear. There was only a quiet, deep reverence. Thaddeus slowly raised one of his enormous, calloused hands. Bernadette trembled, her breath catching in her throat. Gently, with a touch so light it defied his monstrous size, he reached toward the folds of her skirt. He did not grab her. He simply offered his open palm, waiting. For a long, agonizing moment, the world stood still. With a shaking breath, Bernadette slowly pulled her heavily scarred, massive right hand from her skirt and placed it into his. His hand was perhaps the only one in the entire territory large enough to entirely engulf hers. The warmth of his rough palm seeped instantly into her chilled skin. Thaddeus bowed his head. Right there, in front of the cruel, gaping town, the terrifying mountain man brought her oversized, work-battered knuckles to his lips. He pressed a long, deeply respectful kiss against the scars of her labor. A collective, stunned gasp rippled through the onlookers. When he finally lifted his head, a faint, breathtakingly warm smile touched the corners of his bearded mouth. The agency got the name on the telegraph wrong, Thaddeus rumbled. His voice was incredibly deep, a rich, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the wooden planks beneath their feet. He looked directly into her shocked hazel eyes, speaking loudly enough for Elias Thorne and the rest of the silent town to hear. "You are exactly who Moat sent for." Bernadette's heart stopped. She stared at him, Thaddeus, utterly bewildered. Without waiting for a response, Thaddeus effortlessly stooped and scooped up her heavy leather travel bag with his free hand, swinging it over his massive shoulder as if it were filled with feathers. He kept his other hand firmly, securely wrapped around hers. "Come," he murmured, his voice softening so only she could hear. "Let us go home." He gently guided her forward, leading her away from the platform, away from the humiliated Elias Thorne, and away from the staring eyes of the valley. As they walked toward a heavy draft wagon hitched near the edge of town, Bernadette stared at the broad, immovable back of the man holding her hand. Her mind was spinning in absolute chaos. Shikanoeve kept perfectly well that Elias had ordered her. She knew this giant, wild stranger was lying through his teeth to save her dignity. But as the shadow of the towering, snow-capped mountain loomed ahead of them, a chilling, profound question settled deep into her weary bones. Why? Why would a notorious, terrifyingly reclusive mountain man willingly bind himself to the mockery of the town, just to claim a giant, unwanted bride he had never even met? Part high. The heavy draft wagon lurched upward, groaning in deep, wooden protest against the steep, treacherous incline of the mountain trail. Every jolt rattled straight up through the rough wooden seat and into Bernadette's deeply aching spine. Beside her, the giant mountain man handled the heavy leather driving reins with a terrifying, effortless grace. The massive Belgian horses strained against their harnesses, their broad, heavily muscled chests slick with lather, as they hauled the immense, combined weight of the two towering figures up into the thinning, pine-scented air. Bernadette sat as rigidly as an iron spike driven into the earth. She kept her broad shoulders hunched forward, her colossals, work-scarred hands instinctively buried deep within the rough, faded folds of her canvas skirt. The silence between them was an ocean, vast and entirely suffocating. With every mile that separated them from the dusty, mocking valley below, her heart hammered a faster, more frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew the brutal mechanics of the world. A man did not simply claim a 6'8" giantess out of the goodness of his heart. Men looked at her and saw a beast of burden. They saw a mule in a skirt. For 10 grueling years on the eastern shipping docks, she had lived entirely under the crack of a foreman, S-whip, and the cruel, booming laughter of men who laid wagers on how many iron-banded crates the freakish girl could haul before her knees buckled. "Heave, big girl, heave!" The memory of those shouts tasted like blood and sea salt in her dry mouth. She stared down at the scuffed, heavy leather of her work boots, bracing herself for the inevitable truth. Thaddeus was a timber carpenter. He lived alone in the high, unforgiving peaks. He needed someone to haul heavy logs, to split winter cords of wood, to drag stones from the frozen earth. He had claimed her to be his heavy laborer. He had saved her from the town's mockery, only to lock her into a lifetime of isolated, bone-crushing servitude. It was a trade of one cruelty for another. The air grew fiercely, violently cold as the wagon crossed the timberline. The sun dipped behind the jagged, snow-capped peaks, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and gray across the heavily forested trail. Bernadette suppressed a violent shiver. Her torn, sleeveless cotton blouse offered absolutely no protection against the biting mountain wind. Gooseflesh erupted across her thick, wildly muscular biceps, but she bit the inside of her cheek, refusing to make a sound. Showing weakness on the docks earned a person a docked wage or a kick to the ribs. She squeezed her hidden hands tighter, locking her jaw. Thaddeus pulled back steadily on the heavy leather reins. "Whoa." His deep, gravelly voice vibrated through the crisp mountain air. The heavy wagon ground to a halt beneath the canopy of ancient, towering blue spruce trees. Bernadette flinched, her breath catching sharply. This was it. This was the moment the charade ended. He was going to order her down to push the heavy wheels over the rocks. She immediately moved to stand, her heavy muscles tensing to leap down into the mud. A massive, calloused hand gently touched her forearm. The contact was so painfully light, so entirely devoid of force, that Bernadette froze in pure shock. Thaddeus did not look at her with the calculating, cruel eyes of a dock foreman. He reached behind his wide, suspender-clad chest into the bed of the wagon. When his hand returned, it held an enormous, heavy wool coat lined with thick sheepskin. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned toward her. Bernadette squeezed her hazel eyes shut, her powerful shoulders tensing instinctively for a blow. Instead, the heavy, magnificent weight of the wool settled gently over her freezing skin. Thaddeus carefully draped the massive coat across her broad back, his large fingers softly brushing the fabric against the nape of her neck to ensure it covered her completely. Bernadette opened her eyes, her chest rising and falling in rapid, bewildered breaths. She pulled the lapels of the coat around herself. For the first time in her entire adult life, a piece of clothing actually fit her. It did not squeeze her ribs. It did not pull agonizingly tight across her heavy shoulders. It swallowed her in a cocoon of absolute, undeniable warmth. The thick fabric smelled deeply of fresh-cut cedar, wood smoke, and the clean, wild scent of the mountain wind. It smelled exactly like him. Thaddeus picked up the reins once more, never demanding a word of thanks. "The wind bites hard up here," he murmured, his gaze fixed respectfully on the trail ahead. "Keep it close." A strange, unfamiliar lump formed tight in Bernadette's throat. She buried her chin into the thick sheepskin collar, breathing in the scent of cedar. The harsh, defensive walls she had built around her battered heart trembled, just a fraction. This wild, terrifyingly strong mountain man had seen her shivering, and rather than demanding endurance, he had offered warmth. The wagon rolled forward, the weary horses finding their final burst of strength as the dense tree line suddenly broke. Nestled into the side of the mountain, surrounded by an ocean of swaying pines, sat a massive timber cabin. Bernadette stared in absolute awe. It was not a crude, hastily built, trapper-esque shack. It was a masterpiece of woodland architecture, crafted from massive stripped logs as thick as rain barrels. The roof was pitched perfectly to shed the heavy winter snows, and a wide, sturdy porch wrapped around the front, looking out over the breathtaking expanse of the valley far below. Everything about the homestead was built on an impossibly grand scale, designed specifically for a giant. Thaddeus brought the horses to a gentle stop near a large water trough. He stepped down from the wagon, his heavy boots hitting the packed earth with a solid, reassuring thud. Bernadette moved to gather her battered canvas bag, determined to finally prove her worth. Before her fingers could brush the leather handle, Thaddeus was there. He effortlessly hoisted her heavy bag over one massively broad shoulder. With his free hand, he reached up toward her. He was offering his hand to help her down. Bernadette stared at his thick, calloused palm. A dock worker did not receive assistance stepping off a loading ramp. Yet here stood the master of the mountain, waiting patiently, treating her with the quiet reverence of a visiting queen. Trembling, she placed her heavily scarred hand into his. He took her weight flawlessly, guiding her down to the earth without letting her stumble. "The hearth is cold, but the stones hold the afternoon heat," Thaddeus rumbled gently, leading her toward the wide porch steps. Bernadette followed him, her mind struggling to process the impossible reality of the evening. She stepped through the heavy front door and stopped dead. The interior of the cabin was stunning. Beautifully carved wooden beams vaulted high above their heads. But "Ve kep hastate" struck Bernadette the hardest was the sheer size of the doorframes. She did not have to duck. For the first time in her memory, she could stand at her full, towering 6'8" height, without fearing she would crack her skull against a low beam. The furniture, the heavy oak dining table, the thick wooden chairs, was all magnificently oversized. It was a sanctuary built for giants. Thaddeus moved toward the massive stone fireplace to stoke the embers, placing her bag gently beside a large, comfortable-looking, rocking chair. "Moat will fetch fresh water," he murmured, picking up a heavy iron bucket. "Make yourself warm." He stepped out the back door, leaving her entirely alone in the quiet, smelling of cedar and safety. Bernadette took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy wool coat slip slightly from her shoulders. She turned slowly in a circle, taking in the beautiful, hand-carved details of the home. Her gaze drifted down the long, shadowed hallway that extended past the kitchen area. At the very end of the hall, plunged into heavy shadow, stood a single door. It was utterly unlike the rest of the beautifully crafted cabin. It was made of thick, reinforced ironwood, bound heavily in rusted steel strips. And resting dead in the center of the heavy wood was an enormous, terrifyingly thick iron padlock, completely securing the room from the outside. Bernadette took a slow, hesitant step closer, her heart resuming its frantic, fearful rhythm. The lock was cold, heavy, and undeniably forbidding. It was the absolute opposite of the warmth and sanctuary Thaddeus had shown her so far. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain wind swept down her spine. What manner of darkness required a lock that massive? What in God's name was the gentle, stoic giant hiding in the absolute depths of his isolated mountain sanctuary? Part Ba. The morning light broke over the high timberline in a wash of pale gold and bitter frost, piercing the thick glass of the cabin window pane. Bernadette awoke with a violent start. Her massive chest heaved as she bolted upright, her hazel eyes wide and completely terrified. Beneath her, a mattress stuffed thick kepite hot-down feathers yielded softly to her towering, muscular frame. It was the first time in her 26 years she had not slept on a thin canvas cot or a pile of moldering dock straw, but instead of comfort, the softness brought sheer, blinding panic. The sun was already up. On the eastern shipping yards, sleeping past the first gray light of dawn meant the sharp crack of a foreman's birch rod across the back of the knees. It meant a day without wages and a night without bread. She scrambled out of the massive bed, her heavy, calloused feet hitting the polished wooden floorboards with a frantic thud. Her massive hands shook as she grabbed her faded, canvas skirt and torn, sleeveless cotton blouse, hastily pulling them over her wildly muscular frame. She shoved her feet into her scuffed, heavy work boots, ignoring the stiff, unlaced leather. She had to find work. She had to prove she possessed value before the giant mountain man realized she was a burden and sent her back down the mountain to the laughing town. Bernadette slipped silently from the guest bedroom, creeping down the shadowed hall past the terrifying, heavy iron padlocked door she had seen the night before. She bypassed the main kitchen area entirely, though the rich, heavenly scent of frying thick-cut bacon, roasted chicory root, and boiling coffee hung heavy in the warm air. Her stomach twisted in a violent knot of hunger, but she forced herself to swallow the ache. Food was a reward for labor. She had not earned a single crumb. She slipped out the heavy oak back door, stepping into the biting, freezing mountain morning. The air was razor-sharp, instantly raising gooseflesh across her thick, heavily corded biceps. She crossed the frost-covered yard, her breath pluming in white clouds, until she found an open, three-sided timber work shed. Inside lay the tools of a master carpenter and the tools of a laborer. Her eyes immediately locked onto a massive pile of heavy iron logging chains, thick forged steel wedges, and a colossal, long-handled sledgehammer that easily weighed 40 pounds. Familiarity settled into her terrified bones. This was language she understood. This was the currency of her survival. Now, friends, listen to the crackling of the fire for a moment, and consider the tragic nature of a wounded heart. Think of a hound that has been kicked so many times it cringes and cowers at a raised hand offering fresh meat. That is the deeply scarred soul of a laborer, entirely stripped of their humanity. Bernadette did not know how to be a bride. She did not know how to be a woman worthy of rest. She only knew how to be an engine, a tireless beast of burden pulling against the weight of the world, just to earn the right to draw breath. She bent her towering frame, ignoring the agonizing, stiff protest of her spine. She gathered the massive iron chains into her bare arms, looping the freezing, rust-covered metal over her broad, sun-darkened shoulders. She grabbed the enormous sledgehammer with her right hand and scooped up the heavy iron wedges with her left. The sheer weight of the metal was staggering, enough to buckle the knees of any grown man in the valley below. Bernadette merely gritted her teeth, her thick neck muscles straining, and began to march toward the massive woodpile near the edge of the property. The freezing iron bit mercilessly into her skin. The jagged edges of the wedges dug deep into the calluses of her forearms. But she pushed harder, her heavy boots crunching through the frosted grass. Heave, big girl. Heave. The phantom voices of the dock foreman chanted in her mind. Earn your keep. Prove your worth. She was halfway across the yard when the heavy back door of the cabin swung open. Thaddeus stepped out onto the porch. He wore no coat, only his heavy denim trousers and a thermal Henley shirt unbuttoned at the massive column of his throat. He held a steaming tin mug of coffee in one enormous hand. When his deep brown eyes landed on Bernadette, he froze. He did not yell. He did not issue a booming command. He simply moved. He crossed the frozen yard with a terrifying, silent speed, his massive frame eating up the distance in mere seconds. Bernadette's heart hammered against her ribs. She immediately hunched her broad shoulders, anticipating a reprimand for touching his tools without permission. Mort can haul them, Bernadette breathed out rapidly, her voice trembling, her chest heaving under the crushing weight of the iron. Mort am sturdy. Mort can drag the timber. Mort will earn my keep, sir. Thaddeus stopped mere inches from her. His jaw clenched tightly, a muscle ticking wildly beneath his thick, dark beard. Gently, but with absolute, immovable force, he placed his enormous hands directly over hers. Let go, he murmured. His deep, gravelly voice was not angry. It was thick with a profound, agonizing sorrow. Please, she whispered, her hazel eyes wide with pure desperation. If Mort do not work, Mort have no value. Let go. With a smooth, effortless motion, Thaddeus took the entire, crushing weight of the iron chains from her bleeding shoulders. He stripped the heavy sledgehammer from her trembling grip. He did not set them down carefully. He dropped the entire, massive load of iron directly into the frozen mud. The metal hit the earth with a violent, resounding crash that echoed off the jagged mountain peaks. Bernadette flinched, instinctively burying her deeply scarred hands deep into the heavy folds of her canvas skirt, bowing her head in absolute shame. She had failed her very first test. Thaddeus stepped closer, his towering frame completely blocking the freezing morning wind. Slowly, he reached down, gently pulling her trembling wrists out from the fabric of her skirt. He turned her massive, scarred hands over, his thumbs softly brushing the fresh, angry red marks left by the freezing iron. "You are not a mule," Thaddeus rumbled, his voice shaking cape ite hata fierce, protective intensity. He looked up, locking his soulful brown eyes directly onto hers. "There are no quotas here. You will never buy your right to exist on this mountain. You are the lady of this home." Bernadette's breath hitched. A hot, stinging tear spilled over her lower lash line, cutting a clean path through the frontier dust on her weathered cheek. No one had ever called her a lady. Thaddeus kept one hand securely wrapped around hers and gently guided her back toward the cabin. The interior of the kitchen was a sanctuary of heat and life. Thaddeus led her to the massive oak table, gently pressing her down into an oversized, sturdy chair. He moved to the roaring hearth, retrieved a clean cotton towel, and returned to her side. Without asking permission, he took her freezing, damp hands and slowly, meticulously dried them, treating her battered, oversized knuckles with the delicate reverence of a man polishing fine silver. He then pressed a steaming mug of black coffee between her palms. "Drink," he urged softly. "The bacon is ready." Bernadette sat in stunned, absolute silence. A feeling she had never known, a tentative, overwhelming gratitude, began to bloom deep within her heavily guarded chest. She watched the giant mountain man turn his broad back to her, leaning over the hearth to adjust the heavy cast iron skillet hanging over the flames. As he reached up, the fabric of his Henley shirt pulled tight across his massive shoulder. The top button had slipped loose, exposing a sliver of the skin just beneath his collarbone. Bernadette's eyes caught on a horrific, deeply jagged scar. It looked like the violent, ragged marks of thick iron claws, tearing deep into the heavy muscle. The brutal wound spoke of a profound, agonizing violence that stood in stark contrast to the absolute gentleness he had just shown her. Driven by an emotion entirely alien to her, Bernadette set her coffee mug on the table. She stood up, slowly, her towering frame casting a long shadow across the warm kitchen floor. She stepped silently behind him. For the first time in her life, she reached out not to lift, not to pull, and not to brace for a blow. She reached out to offer comfort. Her massive hand, calloused but filled with a delicate, trembling intent, softly brushed the scarred fabric over his shoulder. Thaddeus violently flinched. He recoiled as if she had pressed a white-hot branding iron directly against his bare flesh. He stumbled entirely away from the hearth, his massive chest heaving, his eyes wide and completely wild with an unreadable, suffocating torment. He stared at her hand as if it were a venomous snake, the quiet warmth of the kitchen shattering instantly into a freezing, terrifying distance. Part bone. The terrifying silence stretched through the kitchen, thick and fragile as winter ice. Thaddeus stood pressed against the heavy oak cabinets, his massive chest heaving. His deep brown eyes were wide, haunted by a brutal, invisible ghost. Bernadette immediately took a staggering step backward. She shoved her calloused, trembling hands deep into the faded pockets of her canvas skirt, her heavy shoulders instantly curving inward. She had crossed a line. She had reached out with hands meant only for brute labor, and had broken the solitary sanctuary of the mountain man. Thaddeus squeezed his eyes shut. A harsh, jagged breath rattled through the thick column of his throat. When he opened his eyes again, the wild, animal panic had faded, replaced by a profound, agonizing sorrow. He looked at Bernadette, seeing her cowering posture, seeing her hands buried in her skirt. He slowly lowered his head, his dark beard brushing the collar of his Henley. He did not offer an explanation. He merely stepped back to the cast-iron skillet, his movements deliberate and slow. Moments later, he placed a heavy ceramic plate on the table before her, laden with thick-cut bacon and fried eggs. He poured a second mug of black coffee, setting it gently near her elbow. He did not speak, but the quiet, apologetic tilt of his head spoke volumes. It was an unspoken truce. Motem broken, his posture seemed to confess, but you are safe. Now, friends, there is a distinct kind of language spoken by those who have lived their entire lives under the crushing weight of the world. It is not spoken with tongues, but with blistered palms, aching backs, and the quiet endurance of a sunrise. When two such souls find each other, they do not need poetry to build a bridge. They simply need a shared task. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the frost and leaving a crisp, blindingly bright autumn chill in the mountain air. Thaddeus stepped out into the yard, a colossal, double-bitted splitting maul resting effortlessly across his impossibly broad shoulder. He walked to the massive pile of unsplit pine and oak logs that sat near the timberline. Stripping off his Henley shirt, he stood in only his heavy denim trousers and wide suspenders. The raw, terrifying power of his massive torso was fully exposed to the crisp air, heavily corded muscles rolling beneath sun-darkened skin. He set a thick round of oak onto the chopping block. With a deep, rhythmic exhale, he swung the maul. Hack, crack. The heavy iron bit perfectly into the center of the wood, splitting the stubborn oak in half with the sound of a pistol shot. Bernadette watched from the heavy wooden porch. She held her canvas jacket tightly around her broad shoulders. She watched the fluid, devastating power of the man. He was a force of nature, a giant carving survival out of the unforgiving wilderness. Her eyes drifted to a second chopping block a few yards away. Resting against it was another splitting maul. It was massive, entirely too heavy for any normal man to lift, let alone swing. A surge of profound, irresistible longing gripped her heavily guarded heart. She did not want to sit idle. She did not want to be a delicate thing kept on a shelf. Because she was not delicate. She was a titan. Slowly, she descended the porch steps. She walked across the frozen, trampled grass, her heavy work boots making no sound. Reaching the second stump, she shrugged off her heavy wool coat, letting it drape over a nearby sawhorse. Underneath, she wore only her torn, sleeveless cotton blouse. The biting wind hit her bare arms, but she barely felt it. She stepped up to the second maul. Reaching down, her massive, heavily scarred fingers wrapped around the thick ash handle. She lifted the terrifyingly heavy tool with effortless, fluid grace, testing its balance in her palms. It was a beautifully devastating weapon of labor. Thaddeus paused mid-swing. He rested his maul against his leg, his deep brown eyes fixed on her. He watched as she bent her towering frame, effortlessly hoisting a massive, 80-pound round of knotty pine onto her chopping block. She planted her feet wide, settling her colossal weight into the earth. She did not look at him for permission. She simply inhaled the sharp, pine-scented air. Her thickly muscled arms rose high above her head, the heavy iron maul glinting in the morning sun. Her impossibly broad back muscles flared, shifting beneath the thin, torn cotton of her blouse. With a powerful, explosive breath, she brought the maul down. Crack. The sound was absolutely deafening. The massive pine round exploded into two perfect halves. The shears meaver, earth-shaking force of her blow, sending splinters flying into the air. The heavy iron blade buried itself a full 2 inches into the solid oak of the chopping block below. Bernadette wrenched the maul free, her chest heaving. The familiar, intoxicating burn of physical exertion lighting up her blood. She quickly hoisted another massive log onto the block, preparing to strike again. But she stopped. A strange, unfamiliar prickle washed over the back of her neck. She turned her head slowly, looking across the yard toward Thaddeus. He was staring at her. For a decade on the docks, men had stared at her. They had stared with disgust, with morbid, cruel curiosity, and with outright fear. They looked at her as if she were a monstrous, unnatural beast. But the look in the wild mountain man's eyes was entirely different. His mouth was slightly parted. The heavy muscles of his chest rose and fell in a slow and captivated rhythm. He was looking at her bare, heavily muscled arms, at the terrifying breadth of her shoulders, and at the raw, devastating power she had just unleashed. There was no fear. There was no disgust. There was only pure, undiluted awe. A fierce, burning heat rushed to Bernadette's weathered cheeks. She instinctively reached down to grab the fabric of her skirt, ready to hide her hands, ready to retreat into the shadows of her lifelong shame. Thaddeus did not let her retreat. He offered a slow, incredibly deep, breathtakingly genuine smile. It was a smile that reached all the way to the corners of his soulful brown eyes, transforming his stoic, rugged face into something impossibly handsome. He turned back to his own chopping block, hoisting a new log. He raised his maul. He did not speak, but the invitation was as clear as the ringing of a church bell. Bernadette released the fabric of her skirt. She gripped her ash handle. Crack. Thaddeus swung. Crack. Bernadette echoed. They fell into a beautiful, thunderous rhythm. The two towering titans worked side by side, their massive frames moving in perfect, wordless synchronization. The heavy steel mauls rose and fell, chewing through the mountain of timber. The sharp scent of freshly split pine sap filled the air. Sweat began to bead on their brows, turning the frontier dust on their skin into a slick, golden sheen under the climbing sun. Every few minutes, their eyes would meet across the flying wood chips. Every single time, the same spark of profound, mutual admiration passed between them. Bernadette felt the crushing weight of her lifelong shame begin to fracture and crumble. Here, standing next to a man who possessed the exact same sheer, terrifying physical power, she was not a freak. She was not a circus spectacle. She was his equal. Around midday, Thaddeus drove his maul deep into a stump and walked toward the water trough. He picked up a heavy tin canteen, pulling the cork with his teeth. He took a long drink, the water spilling down his dark beard and onto his massive, bare chest. He walked over to Bernadette, who rested her heavy hands on the top of her maul. He offered her the canteen. As she reached out to take it, her scarred, massive fingers brushed against the thick, calloused knuckles of his hand. The contact sent a jolt of pure, electrifying heat straight up her heavily muscled arm. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Thaddeus did not pull away. His deep brown eyes held hers. A silent, profound current of emotional safety flowing from his unyielding posture straight into her battered heart. For the first time in her life, She felt beautiful. They moved to a freshly felled oak trunk, sitting side by side. The silence between them was no longer heavy with fear or expectation. It was warm. It was the companionable, deeply satisfying quiet of two souls who had finally found someone who perfectly understood the weight they carried. Bernadette looked out over the sweeping, majestic valley below, her massive chest rising and falling. She finally belonged somewhere. But the mountain wind shifted, carrying a sound that sliced brutally through the peaceful afternoon. It was the distinct, rhythmic clatter of iron horseshoes striking the rocky switchback trail leading directly up to the cabin. Thaddeus' head snapped toward the tree line, his heavy jaw clenching instantly into absolute stone. The warm, mist, inviting light completely vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold hand, terrifying and fiercely protective fury. He stood up, his massive frame instantly transforming from a weary laborer into a towering, insurmountable wall of violence. Bernadette scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Someone had made the long, grueling climb up the treacherous mountain. A lone rider emerged slowly from the shadows of the blue spruce pines, his face hidden beneath the wide brim of a dusty bowler hat, leading his exhausted mount straight toward the sanctuary of the giants. Part numb. The rider pulled his horse to a halt at the edge of the clearing, the animal's flanks heaving and coated in a thick lather of gray foam. The man sat slumped in his saddle, his posture radiating a smug, casual arrogance that immediately grated against the raw, honest silence of the mountain morning. He adjusted his bowler hat, letting it tilt back just enough to reveal a pair of small, reptilian eyes that darted greedily across the cabin, the woodpile, and finally, directly onto Bernadette. Thaddeus did not move. He stood, his immense frame blocking Bernadette from the rider's view, his feet planted with the unshakable permanence of a mountain boulder. The double-bitted maul remained in his hand, his grip so tight on the ash handle that the muscles in his forearm stood out in rigid corded cables. "Didn't think you'd be the type to keep pets, Thaddeus," the man drawled, his voice oily and thin. He smirked, his gaze sliding past the mountain man's shoulder to leer at Bernadette's exposed, muscular arms. "Though Mort, suppose a brute like that is the only thing that would find your little cabin habitable." Bernadette felt the hair on her arm stand up. She knew that voice. It was the same tone used by the foreman on the docks, the tone of a man who viewed the world as a marketplace, and every living thing as an object to be appraised, used, or sold. She took a half step behind Thaddeus, her massive frame instinctively shrinking, but she did not hide her hands this time. She held her ground. Thaddeus took a single step forward. The air seemed to vibrate with the sheer, latent violence of his movement. He did not raise his voice, he didn't know to have to. His presence was a landslide. "You are trespassing," Thaddeus rumbled, his words falling like heavy stones into the quiet clearing. "Leave this trail." The rider chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that lacked any genuine mirth. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a crumpled, official-looking document. "Now, hold your horses, giant. Mort met an agent of the territorial court. Mort met here on behalf of Mr. Elias Thorne. Seems there was a bit of a disagreement regarding a breach of contract." He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes locking onto Bernadette with a predator-esque focus. "The lady here owes $300 in travel fees, administrative costs, and damages for the emotional distress caused to Mr. Thorne. Either she pays up, or Mort met legally empowered to seize the equivalent in property. And considering she didn't bring much luggage, Mort met thinking she coming back down the mountain with me to settle the debt at the local workhouse." Bernadette felt the color drain from her face. $300. It was a king's ransom, a number so high it was practically designed to ensure her imprisonment. She looked at Thaddeus, her breath hitching. She had no money. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and the calluses on her hands. The terror of the dockyard surged back into her heart. The cold, damp rooms of the workhouse, the endless, soul-crushing labor for no pay, the permanent cage of debt. Thaddeus did not even glance at the paper. He stepped closer to the horse, his sheer height forcing the rider to crane his neck back uncomfortably. "She is not a debt to be collected," Thaddeus said. His voice was no longer the gravelly whisper of a man at rest. It was the low, dangerous growl of a predator protecting its own. "And there is nothing on this mountain that belongs to you or that coward in the valley." The agent's smirk faltered. He flicked his gaze toward the massive maul in Thaddeus' hand. "This is legal, ass. You mountain savage. You want to interfere with the law? You want to see what happens when the sheriff hears you harboring a runaway?" Thaddeus closed the remaining distance in one terrifying stride. He grabbed the bridle of the horse with his left hand, forcing the animal's head down with a casual, brutal display of raw strength. The horse whinnied in panic, dancing backward. But Thaddeus remained anchored. "The sheriff knows me," Thaddeus stated, his eyes boring into the agent's own, "and he knows better than to come to this timberline. You are going to turn your horse around. You are going to eat the dust of this trail until you hit the valley floor. And if Mott hear your name, or that of Elias Thorne, on this mountain again, Mott will not be speaking with words." The agent's face turned a mottled, sickly shade of white. He jerked the bridle from Thaddeus's grip, his hands trembling violently. He clearly realized that he was not in the valley, where laws and social pressures could force a man to bend. He was in the heart of the wild, standing before a force of nature that cared nothing for paper or coin. "You a fool," the agent spat, turning his mount around with a sharp, stinging kick. "You paying for a beast that's only going to cause you trouble. You'll be sorry when the town comes to collect on your hide, too." He spurred the horse into a frantic, stumbling gallop, disappearing into the dense, dark shadows of the pine trees. Bernadette stood frozen, her hands gripping the fabric of her skirt. Her heart was hammering a chaotic, uneven rhythm. She looked at Thaddeus, waiting for the anger to turn toward her. She expected him to count the cost, to look at her with the crushing weight of disappointment, to finally admit that she was indeed a liability he could not afford to keep. Thaddeus turned slowly. He walked back toward the chopping block, his breathing steady, his face returning to its mask of quiet, stoic composure. He picked up his maul and leaned it against the trunk of a tree. He noticed Bernadette's trembling. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply walked to the water trough, grabbed a clean cloth, and began to wash the sweat and dust from his forearms. He worked with methodical, rhythmic care, his movements fluid and beautiful. Bernadette finally found her voice, though it emerged as little more than a ragged whisper. "Mott have no money to repay you." Thaddeus paused. He dipped the cloth again, the water rippling in the sunlight. He turned to look at her, his dark, soulful eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her knees feel weak. "Mott did not pay for a debt," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Mott paid for my own peace. And since you arrived, Mott have found more of it than Mott have in the last 10 years. Bernadette felt a sob catch in her throat. She looked at his massive, scarred hands, then down at her own. She thought of the life she had escaped, the laughing, pointing crowds, the constant, draining fear of being lesser. She looked up at the mountains that surrounded them, the sheer, unyielding stone of the peaks, the vast, silent forest, and the home they had built together. "Why?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could check it. "Why would you choose to protect me?" Moat am just a worker. Mort am not. Moat am not anything more than that. Thaddeus set the cloth down. He walked toward her, stepping into the space where the fear usually lived. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a physical, warming presence. You think your value is measured in what you can carry, he observed, his voice soft, almost meditative. You think you are a tool. But Mort have watched you. You have a quietness in you that is stronger than any storm. You have a dignity that survives even when the world tries to strip it away. You are the only person who has ever looked at this mountain and not asked me for anything but the space to breathe. He stepped even closer, his shadow falling over her like a comforting blanket. That is not a debt, Bernadette. That is a gift. He turned and walked toward the cabin, leaving her standing in the golden afternoon light. Bernadette looked down at her hands. They were the same hands, calloused, oversized, scarred by a decade of brutality. But for the first time, she did not feel the urge to hide them. She felt a deep, terrifying, and wonderful sense of belonging take root in her chest. She belonged to the mountain. She belonged to the man who saw her, not as a giantess, but as a person. But as she followed him toward the porch, the golden light seemed to dim. She thought of the agent's parting words, the threat that the town would come to collect on his hide, too. She realized that by protecting her, Thaddeus had stepped directly into the path of the valley's cruelty. He was an outcast, a man who lived on the edge of the world, and now he had invited the world's malice to his doorstep. She paused at the door, her hand hovering over the rough-hewn timber. A question she hadn't dared to ask before. A question about his past, his scars, and the reason he lived so far from the reach of men, burned in her mind. If she was the reason he was being hunted now, did she have the strength to stand between him and the rest of the world? Or was she, in her sheer, muscular, and misunderstood existence, only bringing the mountain down upon the only man who had ever truly seen her? She stepped inside, her heart heavy with a new, strange resolve, unaware that in the corner of the living room, hidden beneath a pile of heavy wool blankets, lay the answer to why he had truly, desperately needed someone as strong as she was. Part Sow. The blizzard did not arrive with a warning. It descended from the high, jagged peaks like a white shroud, devouring the valley below and sealing the mountain in a suffocating, swirling gray wall. Within an hour, the world beyond the porch was gone, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind howling like a trapped animal against the reinforced logs of the cabin. Bernadette stood by the hearth, feeding the roaring fire with split pine. The warmth was a physical embrace, contrasting sharply with the terrifying, howling void outside. Beside her, Thaddeus sat at the massive oak table, his attention entirely consumed by a small, delicate piece of cedar. He held a thin, razor-sharp carving knife in his massive, scarred hand, his focus so absolute that he seemed oblivious to the storm's fury. She watched him, her eyes tracing the fluid, controlled movements of his fingers. For a man of such earth-shaking physical power, his touch was impossibly light. As she looked on, the shape emerged from the wood, a wild mountain rose, its petals curling with lifelike grace. "It is beautiful," she murmured, her voice soft against the crackling of the fire. Thaddeus paused, his thumb brushing the grain of the wood. Flowers are fragile things, Bernadette. They have to be strong to survive this altitude. They bloom where nothing else dares. He looked up, his deep brown eyes catching the firelight. The distance that had existed between them earlier, a lingering echo of his reaction to her touch, had thawed replaced by the quiet, heavy comfort of their shared isolation. Moat was a circus act, too, he said suddenly, his voice low, lacking the gravelly edge of his earlier commands. Bernadette froze, a piece of firewood suspended in her hand. What? Thaddeus turned the cedar flower over in his palm. Not in a tent, not with crowds, but in the logging camps. Mott was the giant of the Cascades. Mott was the man they bet on. Mott was the man who could move mountains, so they never asked if Mott was tired. They never asked if Mott was human. They only wanted to see what Mott could break. He stood, his massive frame casting a long, dancing shadow against the wall. He walked to the window, watching the snow lash against the glass. Mott left because Mott was tired of being a tool. Moat came here to build something that was mine. Something that was still. Bernadette felt her heart swell with a poignant, ache-filled empathy. She crossed the room, stopping a respectful distance from him. You built a sanctuary. Moat built a fortress, he corrected, his voice tinged with a self-deprecating irony. Moat thought if Moat made everything big enough, if Moat lived high enough, the world would forget Moat existed. Moat thought Moat could outrun the shame of being something they only wanted to use. He turned to her, now, his gaze intense, searching her face. But then you came. And you were taller. You were stronger. And you were carrying the same ghosts. Bernadette looked down at her own hands. Those hands that had hauled crates for men who didn't know her name. Moat thought Moat was the only one. Moot thought Moot was broken in a way that couldn't be fixed. Thaddeus took a step toward her. The air between them grew charged, heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. You aren't broken, Bernadette. You are forged. There is a difference. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them. Bernadette held her breath. She didn't flinch. She watched, mesmerized, as his large, calloused fingers brushed against her knuckles. The contact was warm, steady, and grounding. She felt the strength of him. The absolute, unwavering support he had offered from the moment he kissed her hand on the platform. She turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. His palm was hot, his skin rough. But his touch was the most gentle thing she had ever known. A profound, aching intimacy bloomed in her chest. A feeling of being finally, truly seen. Tell me, she whispered, looking at the scar on his shoulder, then back to his eyes. What happened to you? Why do you fear being touched? Thaddeus' jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, a shadow of pain flickering across his features. Suddenly, a violent, bone-rattling crash shattered the air. The entire cabin shuddered as if struck by a giantess fist. A high, piercing shriek of splintering timber followed, sounding like a dying tree snapping in the gale. The fire in the hearth flared, sparks showering the room, and the floorboards beneath them groaned under the weight of a sudden, unnatural impact. Thaddeus' expression shifted instantly from vulnerability to predatory focus. He dropped her hand and moved with the speed of a striking viper, grabbing his heavy winter coat from the hook by the door. The woodshed, he snarled, his voice a low, urgent command. The weight of the snow, the roof has collapsed. Bernadette didn't hesitate. She grabbed her own thick coat and pulled it on as she followed him toward the back entrance. The storm was a roaring, white demon, the wind pulling at the heavy door with impossible strength. Thaddeus forced it open, and the two of them stepped out into the white abyss. The yard was gone. In its place was a swirling, blinding vortex of ice and wind. The timber shed, the place where they had worked side by side, was utterly obliterated, crushed under the weight of a massive drift of snow that had slid from the roof of the main cabin. Thaddeus roared something that was torn away by the wind, pointing toward the wreckage. Beneath the mangled beams and the mountain of snow, a dark, heavy shape was trapped, not a tool, but the massive timber support beam they used to stabilize the entire structure. He lunged toward the wreckage, his massive frame digging into the snow. Bernadette followed, her heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm. She reached the debris, just as Thaddeus began to heave against the weight. "It's pinned," he shouted, his voice strained. "The main support. It's going to bring the whole structure down on the storage." He shoved his shoulder against the beam, his neck corded with effort, his boots sliding in the slick, icy slush. He was a mountain of a man, but the combined weight of the snow and the fallen timber was an impossible force, even for him. He was losing his footing. Bernadette saw the danger. She saw the way his muscles were beginning to tremble under the crushing, unbalanced pressure. If he slipped, the weight would pin him. She didn't think. She didn't to worry about her own safety. She saw the man who had looked at her with awe, the man who had treated her like a lady, struggling against the weight that threatened to break him. She braced her boots against a rock, threw her arms around the massive, frozen beam, and locked her hands. Together, she screamed into the wind. She threw her massive, muscular back into the effort. She felt the burn in her legs, the agonizing strain in her spine, the sheer, glorious power of her body, working in perfect, desperate tandem with his. She gritted her teeth, her hazel eyes blazing, and pushed with every ounce of strength she possessed. The beam shifted. Thaddeus grunted, a sound of raw, explosive exertion, and pushed with her. The heavy, snow-laden timber groaned, lifted, and finally skidded free of the collapse. But as the pressure released, the mountain of snow above them, unstable and waiting, let out a terrifying, low rumble. A fresh, massive wave of white, heavy, and unforgiving, tore loose from the eaves of the cabin roof. Thaddeus saw it coming. "Bernadette, look out." He threw himself toward her, his arms wide, his massive body shielding hers just as the crushing weight of the avalanche descended. The world went white, then black, and then completely, terrifyingly silent. Part Bay. Darkness was absolute, heavy and freezing, smelling of pulverized cedar and the sharp metallic tang of panic. Bernadette gasped, but her lungs filled only with a fine, powdery dusting of snow. She tried to move, but her limbs were trapped, pinned beneath a weight that felt like the earth itself had collapsed upon her. The terror was a cold, sharp blade, but it was quickly replaced by a desperate, burning clarity. She was strong. She was built for this. She shifted her shoulders, the muscles in her back screaming in protest, and forced a pocket of air around her face. She pushed upward, her fingernails clawing into the frozen crust of the avalanche, until her hand broke through the surface into the howling, frigid night. She shoved herself upward, gasping for breath, the icy wind stinging her skin like 1,000 needles. She was alive. But as she clawed her way out of the suffocating drifts, her heart stopped. Thaddeus. He lay stretched out beneath the twisted, jagged frame of the collapsed shed. A massive, iron-hard timber beam had pinned his legs to the frozen ground, and the bulk of the snowslide had buried his torso. He was deathly pale, his eyes closed, his breathing a shallow, rattling sound that barely disturbed the silence of the storm. Bernadette felt the world tilt. For a moment, the old shame tried to crawl back, the fear that she was the bringer of ruin, the curse that had finally broken the only man who had ever stood by her. She looked at his massive, unconscious form, and a sudden, violent surge of defiance roared through her blood. She would not let him go. She crawled to him, her hands trembling as she swept the snow from his face. His skin was ice cold. She gripped the massive beam that held him captive, her muscles bunching, her veins bulging as she exerted every ounce of her raw, titanic strength. The wood bit into her palms, drawing blood, but she didn't care. She growled, a sound of primitive, unyielding need, and heaved. The beam groaned. It lifted. Just a fraction, enough for him to slide free. Bernadette scrambled, dragging his heavy, limp body across the frozen earth and back toward the porch. Every inn was a war against the wind, a war against the cold, and a war against the sheer physical weight of the man. When she finally reached the shelter of the cabin, she collapsed, pulling him inside, and slamming the heavy door shut against the storm. The interior of the cabin was dark, the fire having dwindled to a few listless embers. She didn't pause. She dragged him to the hearth, wrapping him in every blanket she could find, and stoked the fire until the room roared with heat. "Thaddeus," she whispered, her voice cracking as she pressed her ear to his massive, silent chest. "Thaddeus, wake up." He didn't move. She stripped away his wet, frozen clothing, her hands moving they had a desperate clinical efficiency. She didn't feel shame or awkwardness. She felt only a terrifying, all-consuming need to keep the heat in his body. She rubbed his skin, massaged his limbs, and curled her own massive, warm frame against his to draw him back from the edge of the void. Hours bled into one another. The storm raged on. But inside, the temperature began to climb. Finally, Thaddeus stirred. His eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes that were glassy, unfocused, and burning with a deep, consuming fever. He let out a jagged, pained breath, his fingers clutching at the blankets. "Cold," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its usual, gravelly strength. "The mountain. It takes. It always takes." "No," Bernadette whispered, stroking his dark, matted hair away from his forehead. "It won't take you. Not today." He groaned, his head rolling against the floorboards. In his delirium, he gripped her hand, his strength still startlingly potent despite his weakness. "Bernadette, you shouldn't be. You should have left. The mountain knows. It knows I failed. I failed him." Bernadette stilled. "Who? Who did you fail?" Thaddeus' eyes shifted, locking onto her with a painful, crystalline intensity. "My brother. The wood. The collapse. Mort was the strong one. Mott was the giant. And I let him slip. Mort let him go under the ice. And I stayed. Mott always stay." He collapsed back into the pillows, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. Bernadette sat back, her mind reeling, the iron padlocked room at the end of the hall, the secret, oversized furniture, the scars on his shoulder, the isolation. It was just a choice of a recluse. It was a self-imposed prison of guilt. He believed his strength was a burden, a curse, that had failed the one person he was supposed to protect. She looked at the man who had pulled her from the platform, the man who had kissed her scarred hands, the man who had fought the world to give her a home. A massive, seismic shift occurred in her heart. She realized, with a profound, aching clarity, that he hadn't saved her just because he was kind. He had saved her because he needed to believe that strength could be used for good. He needed to be redeemed as much as she needed to be seen. They were two broken giants, tethered to one another in the center of a freezing, uncaring world. Bernadette leaned down, pressing her forehead against his. She felt the fierce, stubborn heat of his fever, but she also felt the solid, rhythmic beat of his heart. "You didn't fail me," she whispered, her voice fierce with promise. "And you aren't alone anymore. Mort am here. Thaddeus, shush. And Mort am not going anywhere." She stood up and walked down the hall toward the iron padlocked door. She had spent her life running from secrets, but she knew now that she could not heal him until she faced the darkness he kept locked away. She reached out, her hand hovering over the cold, rusted surface of the lock. The wind shrieked outside, a frantic, desperate sound. She didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker, braced her feet, and prepared to shatter the silence of his past. But as the heavy iron of the poker touched the padlock, the metal groaned not from her force, but as if it were unlocking from within. The door drifted open, revealing a room bathed in the faint, silvery light of the moon filtering through a high, snow-crusted window. Bernadette stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The room was not a tomb of grief as she had feared. It was a workshop, a massive, sprawling archive of wooden masterpieces. There were tables, chairs, cabinets, and sculptures, all carved with a level of detail that defied belief. Every single piece was constructed for a giant. There was a dining set large enough for a king, a bed frame carved with mountain flora, and in the very center, a rocking chair, its wood smooth to the texture of silk. It was a home. It was a life, built in secret, waiting for someone to occupy it. Bernadette turned back toward the main room. Thaddeus was watching her from the floor, his eyes clear for the first time, his expression a mix of raw, terrifying vulnerability and something that looked dangerously like hope. The storm was beginning to break. The wind was softening. The violent, crashing waves of the blizzard settling into a rhythmic, hushed sigh. But for Bernadette, the world was forever changed. She was just a guest in his home anymore. She was the missing piece of his soul. She walked back to him, kneeling on the floor, and took his hand. "You built this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You built all of this for us." Thaddeus reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his touch lingering, heavy with a longing that had been buried for years. Mott built it because Mott was waiting for someone who could sit in it without breaking it. He drew her closer, the gap between them vanishing entirely. In the firelight, the giant mountain man and his giant bride finally found the only thing that could survive the mountain-esque cold, the devastating, beautiful, and absolute truth of their own connection. Part 10. The fever broke in the pale, ethereal hours of dawn. Thaddeus drifted into a deep, natural slumber, the heavy, ragged gasps of his delirium smoothing into the steady, powerful rhythm of a sleeping giant. Bernadette sat on the floorboards beside him, her back against the cool stone of the hearth. She was exhausted, a deep, marrow-aching weariness that felt as heavy as the iron she had hauled on the docks. But she could not close her eyes. She watched the rise and fall of his chest. She watched the way his thick, dark beard moved with his breath, the way his massive, broad shoulders relaxed, finally free of the phantom weight he had carried for so long. The room was silent, save for the crackle of the dying fire and the distant, hollow whistling of the wind retreating across the peaks. She had seen the room. She had seen the truth. The secret chamber was not a monument to his failure. It was a testament to his desperate, secret hope. Every piece of furniture, every delicate carving, every sanded surface was an invitation he hadn't known how to issue. He had spent years preparing a home for a woman he thought he would never find, a woman who matched his scale and his strength. Bernadette reached out, her fingers hovering just inches above his forearm. She didn't touch him, not yet. She was still processing the seismic shift in her own reality. For her entire life, her strength had been a source of alienation. She had been the big girl, the anomaly, the laborer to be exploited. She had spent years apologizing for the space she occupied, for the sound of her footsteps, for the height that made men uncomfortable. Here, in this cabin, she was not an anomaly. She was the anchor. As the sun began to bleed through the frost-crusted windows, casting long, amber fingers across the floor, Thaddeus stirred. He didn't open his eyes immediately. He shifted, his hand finding the space where hers rested, his fingers brushing against her knuckles. "You stayed," he murmured, his voice a rough, morning, woken rumble. "I stayed," she replied, her own voice steady, anchored by a new, firm resolve. He opened his eyes. The glassiness of the fever had vanished, leaving behind the deep, soulful brown of a man who had stared into his kept no abyss and found someone else standing there with him. He looked at her, then toward the hall, toward the open, revealed door of the workshop. "Mort thought Mort would lose it," he whispered, his gaze dropping to the floor. Mott thought if anyone saw it, it would just be another thing they would laugh at. Another giant folly. Bernadette moved, crawling across the floor until she was kneeling beside him. She took his hand in both of hers, her grip firm, deliberate, and entirely unafraid. "It is the most beautiful thing Mott have ever seen," she said, her voice resonant and clear. "It isn't folly, Thaddeus. It evidence of a heart that refused to stop believing, even when the world told you to bury it." Thaddeus looked up, his chest hitching, a rare, visceral display of vulnerability from a man who had built his life on stoic endurance. He reached up, his hand cupping the side of her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Moot was so afraid," he confessed, the words strained and heavy. "Afraid that if you saw who I was, the man who failed his own blood, the man who hides in the timberline, you would see the truth. That Mott am just as broken as the things Mott build." "We are both broken," Bernadette said, leaning into his touch, closing her eyes. "But we are broken in the same places. And we are strong enough to carry each other." For a long time, the only sound in the cabin was their shared breathing. The air felt charged. A silent, unfolding promise. The fear of rejection. The fear of the town. The fear of their own mismatched natures. It all seemed to evaporate, burned away by the simple, profound act of being known. Thaddeus sat up slowly, wincing as the bruises from the avalanche made themselves known. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her in a way that didn't just offer protection, it sought it. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his presence a massive, grounding weight. "The town," he whispered against her skin. "They will come back. Now that the agent has seen us. Now that they know Mort am protecting you. They will not stop." Bernadette pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. Her hazel eyes were bright, fierce, and entirely devoid of the fear that had defined her existence on the docks. "Let them come," she said. Thaddeus looked at her, his expression a mix of surprise and burgeoning, radiant pride. "Moat spent my life hauling crates for men who didn't know my name," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "They kept itehat every word. Moot spent my life being a beast of burden because Moot thought that was all Moot was worth. But Mort am not a beast, and Moat am not a debt. And neither are you." She stood up, her towering frame catching the morning light, her posture radiating a grace that had been hidden beneath the slouch of a decade of shame. She went to the hearth, stoked the fire, and began to prepare the morning coffee. The domesticity of the act was a revolution. It was the assertion of her right to exist, to nourish, to care. Thaddeus watched her, his gaze filled with a profound, aching admiration. He stood, his movements stiff but purposeful, and joined her at the table. He took the mug she offered, their fingers lingering, an unspoken agreement passing between them. The paradigm shift was complete. They were no longer the mountain man who hid and the giantess who survived. They were partners, an equal, immovable force. The assumptions they had lived by, that they were destined for isolation, that their strength was a curse, that they were unlovable, had been shattered by the weight of the snow and the warmth of their own persistence. But as they sat in the quiet, as Joel morning, a sudden sound echoed through the cabin, a sharp, rhythmic tapping on the heavy front door. It was the wind. It was deliberate. Thaddeus stood, his eyes darkening. He moved toward the door, his hand instinctively going to the latch. He pulled it open, expecting the agent, or perhaps the town sheriff. Instead, standing on the porch was a young woman, no more than 20, bundled in a threadbare coat, her face raw from the cold. She was shivering violently, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic terror. "Please," she gasped, her voice cracking as she leaned against the doorframe. "You have to help me. They coming. And if they find me here, they'll kill us all." Thaddeus and Bernadette exchanged a look, a silent, instantaneous communication. They had fought their own demons. They had faced the avalanche. And they had claimed their own dignity. But the mountain was not done with them. Thaddeus pulled the girl inside, his protective instincts flaring even as he realized the cost. "Who is coming?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The girl looked at Bernadette, then at Thaddeus, her gaze settling on the immense, powerful frame of the couple. "The men who own the valley," she whispered. "They aren't just coming for you, Bernadette. They coming to take back the mountain." The silence that followed was suffocating. Bernadette felt the old fear tug at the back of her mind, but she looked at Thaddeus and then at the girl. The threat was real, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. The town didn't just want a debt paid, they wanted the mountain, and they were willing to use any weapon, physical or social, to break the two giants who stood in their way. The core loop, the reason Thaddeus had been cast out, the reason the valley feared him, was about to be forced into the light. And as Bernadette stood beside him, she realized that their path toward happiness was not just a romantic journey. It was a battle for their very right to exist as they were. "We stay," Bernadette said, her voice ringing out in the quiet cabin, firm as an iron spike. Thaddeus nodded, a slow, grim smile touching his lips. He looked at her, and, for the first time, He didn't just see a bride, he saw his equal. The only person on earth who could stand beside him when the world finally came to claim its price. Part Sheen. The girl's name was Clara, and she was the daughter of the local doctor. A man who had been Thaddeus' only ally in the valley years ago. She huddled by the fire, her teeth chattering as she spilled a tale that made the cold mountain air seem warm by comparison. The valley's expansionists, led by a syndicate of land-hungry rail magnates, were systematically purging the foothills of anyone who stood in their path. They weren't just after the timber. They were after the mountain's strategic passes. Thaddeus stood by the window, his massive frame silhouetted against the morning light. He had been silent for 20 minutes, his eyes fixed on the distant, fog-choked valley. Bernadette stood beside him, her hand resting firmly on the small of his back, a gesture of unwavering, anchoring support. "They don't want the timber," Thaddeus rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "They want the path behind this cabin. It's the only way to move equipment into the high country without paying the rail tolls." Bernadette felt his muscles tighten beneath her touch. He wasn't just defending a home, he was defending a secret. "If they take the mountain," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with terror, "they ought to level everything. They've already burned the old homesteads on the lower slope. They aren't asking anymore. Thaddeus. They're coming with men, with dynamite, and with the law on their side." Bernadette looked at Thaddeus. She saw the flickers of his past, the memories of the logging camps, the way he had been treated, and the reason he had fled the reach of the valley. It was just a desire for solitude. It was a knowledge of what men would do when they saw something they couldn't control. "We have time," Bernadette said, her voice cutting through the heavy tension. She didn't look at Clara, she looked at Thaddeus. "The pass is snowed in. Even they can get heavy equipment up here until the melt is finished. We have days, maybe a week." Thaddeus turned to her, his brow furrowed, his eyes searching hers. "They will target you, Bernadette, net. You know that. They look paint you as the reason for the trouble. They look use your size, your past, everything to turn the town against us." Bernadette felt a cold, sharp pang of fear. Not for herself, but for him. She knew the malice of the world. She knew how easily they could make a monster out of a woman like her. But she also looked at the room, at the life they had started to carve out, and she felt a sudden, fierce, and undeniable longing to fight for it. "Let them try," she said, stepping closer to him, her presence filling the room. "They've already called me a beast. They've already mocked me. What else can they do? The only thing they can take is what we allow them to." Thaddeus reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was electric, a sudden, blinding contrast to the grim reality of the world below. "You are more than enough," he whispered, his voice thick with a raw, terrifying intensity. They spent the next few hours in a fever of preparation, their movements synchronized and efficient. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They moved with the rhythm of two people who had finally found their purpose. They secured the cabin, reinforced the doors, and moved the most vital supplies into the protected, natural cellar beneath the workshop. Clara watched them from the corner, her expression a mix of awe and fear. She had never seen anything like them. They were not just a couple. They were a singular force, a pair of giants reclaiming their place in the world. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley, Bernadette found Thaddeus in the workshop. He was staring at the rocking chair he had crafted, the centerpiece of his secret life. Mott was going to stay here until Mott died, he admitted, his voice quiet. Mott thought Mott was waiting for a ghost. Mott day, I did not realize Mott was waiting for someone who would make me want to live. Bernadette stepped into the room, the scent of fresh cedar and warm, dusty air wrapping around her. She approached him, standing tall, her towering frame casting a shadow that blended perfectly with his. "You aren't waiting anymore," she said, her voice a soft, resonant melody. He looked at her, his dark, soulful eyes reflecting the firelight. For the first time, he didn't look like a man guarding a fortress. He looked like a man who had finally put down the sword. He reached out, taking her hand and pulling her closer. The contact was heavy, profound, and filled with a longing that made Bernadette's heart hammer against her ribs. He didn't speak. He simply pulled her into his arms. The embrace was not the desperate, protecting hold of the avalanche. It was the slow, steady and deliberate hold of a man who was finally choosing to be vulnerable. Bernadette leaned into him, her head resting against his massive, broad chest, her hands tracing the lines of his scarred, powerful back. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, a steady, anchoring pulse that was the only truth in the world. "Mott don't know if we can win," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough. "We don't have to win the whole world," Bernadette replied, pulling back to look him in the eye. "We just have to hold this mountain." Thaddeus smiled, a slow, breathtakingly genuine expression that lit up his eyes. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a touch so light, so achingly tender, that Bernadette felt the world spin. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an agreement, a binding promise that they were no longer two separate stories, but one shared, enduring life. The longing between them was intense, a palpable, heavy weight that filled the room. Bernadette felt the vulnerability of the moment, the fear of what was coming, and the sheer, overwhelming joy of being where she was. She was no longer the laborer, no longer the circus freak, no longer the woman hiding her hands in her skirt. She was Thaddeus's bride. But, as they stood there, lost in the quiet intimacy of the workshop, the distant, neat, muffled sound of a bell rang out from the valley below, the heavy, rhythmic tolling of the town's fire alarm. It was a sign. The valley had caught the scent of the struggle. Thaddeus broke the kiss, his expression instantly shifting to one of grim, focused resolve. He walked to the window, his gaze scanning the horizon. "They re-coming," he said, his voice a low, steady command. Bernadette stood beside him, her posture radiating a calm, unbreakable strength. She looked out at the twilight, the snow-dusted forest, and the path that led down to the valley. She knew the fight was coming, and she knew the town would bring their cruelty to their doorstep. She felt a sudden, strange flicker of curiosity. How would the town respond when they saw them together, not as two outcasts, but as an undeniable, powerful unit? How would they react when they saw that the giant man and the giant woman were not just surviving, but thriving? A formal invitation to the town's spring festival, pinned to the main gate of their property months ago, still sat on the mantel, forgotten. "Thaddeus," she said, her voice steady. "We aren't going to hide. We're going to show them." Thaddeus turned, his eyes searching hers, his expression shifting from grim resolve to a sudden, startling wonder. "Show them what?" "That we are not their monsters," she replied, her hazel eyes blazing with a newfound, fierce pride. "And that we are never going to be afraid again." She walked toward the mantel, picking up the dusty, neglected invitation. She looked at it for a long, steady moment, then turned to him. The question hung in the air, heavy and exhilarating. Would they brave the town's mockery one more time, not to hide, but to stand as a testament to their own existence? The prospect of descending the mountain, of walking into the heart of the valley that had tried to destroy them, was a challenge that escalated the stakes beyond anything they had ever faced. But as she looked at Thaddeus, she knew there was no other way. The mountain belonged to them, and it was time to let the valley know who was standing on it. Part Mui. The morning of the festival arrived with a crisp, clear sky that bled from indigo to a soft, inviting violet over the jagged peaks. Bernadette stood before the polished, full-length mirror Thaddeus had mounted in the main cabin, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she fastened the buttons of her blouse. It was a simple, sturdy garment, dark blue linen, practical and woven for heavy wear, but it felt like silk against her skin. It was clean, it was mended. It fit the frame of her body with a dignity she had never allowed herself to claim before. She brushed her hair, pulling it back from her face with a single braided leather strip, revealing the strength of her jaw and the quiet, steady fire in her hazel eyes. She turned as the heavy oak door creaked open. Thaddeus stood in the threshold, his massive frame filling the space, casting a long shadow across the warm floorboards. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a heavy dark wool coat over a crisp, white shirt that struggled to contain the breadth of his shoulders. His beard was trimmed, his hair neat, and his eyes, they held a depth of adoration that made Bernadette's breath hitch in her chest. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a mountain of a man silenced by the sight of the woman who now occupied his home and his heart. He walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, and stopped just within the intimate space of her personal gravity. "You look," he paused, searching for a word that could possibly contain the enormity of what he saw. "You look like you belong to the peaks." Bernadette felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a heat that had nothing to do with the hearth. "And you look like a man who has decided to come down from them." Thaddeus smiled, a slow, genuine movement of his lips that reached his dark eyes. He held out his hand. It was an invitation, not just to the wagon, but to the world. A challenge to the valley that had discarded them both. The journey down the mountain was different than the one she had taken weeks ago. Then, she had huddled in the wagon, bracing herself for the humiliation of the town's gaze, believing she was a burden to be cast aside. Today, she sat tall, her hands resting openly in her lap. She felt the weight of Thaddeus' presence beside her, the steady rhythmic strength of him. They were a pair, an immovable, undeniable unit. As the dense pine forest gave way to the dusty outskirts of the valley town, the noise of the festival began to drift upward. The faint, tinny sound of a fiddle, the rumble of laughter, the scent of roasting meat and sweet cider. Bernadette felt the familiar prickle of anxiety at the base of her neck. The town. The place where they had laughed at her shoulders. The place where Elias Thorne had shrieked at her height. Thaddeus noticed the shift in her posture. He didn't pull the reins. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply reached over, his massive, calloused hand finding hers. He squeezed her fingers, a firm, grounding pressure that communicated everything he could to say. "Moat and here. We are here. And we are not hiding." They rounded the final bend of the trail and entered the main thoroughfare of the valley. The festival was in full swing. Stalls were set up along the wooden boardwalks. Children ran between the legs of parents, and the town square was packed with the familiar faces of the valley's residents. The wagon rolled to a stop, the horses' harnesses jingling softly. Silence did not fall immediately. The fiddle continued to play for a few extra bars. and a merchant kept shouting about his apples. But slowly, surely, the noise died. It started at the edge of the square and rippled inward. A wave of sudden, stunned awareness. Bernadette braced herself for the laughter. She braced for the pointing fingers. The cruel, sharp comments about her size. The derogatory remarks about the monster and her keeper. But the laughter didn't come. Instead, there was a profound, heavy stillness. Bernadette climbed down from the wagon, her movements fluid and controlled. She stepped onto the wooden planks, her tall, towering frame catching the golden light of the afternoon sun. She didn't hunch. She didn't hide her hands in the folds of her skirt. She stood at her full height, her shoulders broad and proud, her gaze sweeping across the crowd with a quiet, regal composure. Behind her, the fine Thaddeus descended. He stood beside her, and his chest wide, his dark coat accentuating the sheer, terrifying power of his physical form. The townsfolk stared. They looked from the man to the woman, and then back again. The mockery they had intended to unleash died in their throats. Why? Because they weren't seeing a pathetic, broken pair of oddities anymore. They were seeing a masterpiece of nature. They were seeing two people who carried themselves with a dignity that made the town's own frantic, petty judgments seem small and hollow. Bernadette saw the shift in their eyes. It wasn't to love. Not yet, but it was a begrudging, startled respect. She realized then that the town had mocked her before, because she had asked to be mocked. She had carried herself as a servant, a tool, a freak. But now, walking with the mountain man who cherished her, she carried herself as a queen of the timberline. A woman near the general store dropped her basket, her hand covering her mouth in a gasp of purely aesthetic shock. The blacksmith, who had been the loudest to jeer weeks ago, leaned against his anvil, his mouth slightly parted, his expression one of muted awe. Bernadette felt a surge of triumph so sharp it almost brought tears to her eyes. She leaned slightly toward Thaddeus, her voice a low murmur that only he could hear. "They aren't laughing." Thaddeus squeezed her hand, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his chin tilted with a quiet, fierce pride. "They have nothing to laugh at," he replied, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "They are looking at the only real thing in this valley." They began to walk. The crowd parted. It was the terrified scurry of the depot platform. It was a respectful, unconscious yielding. The two giants moved through the heart of the town, their footsteps echoing with a rhythmic, heavy synchronicity. Bernadette felt the eyes of the town on her. The women noting the strength of her stride, the men noting the undeniable power of the man who walked at her side. She felt beautiful. Not in the delicate, porcelain way the town's elite held themselves, but in the way the ancient pines and the unyielding rock of the mountains were beautiful. She felt ancient, powerful, and deeply, intensely alive. She looked up at Thaddeus, catching the slight, satisfied tilt of his lips. He was proud of her. He was just standing by her. He was showing her off. He was declaring to the valley that this woman, this tall, strong, muscular, magnificent woman was his. The emotional safety he provided was not a shield against the world. It was a platform from which she could finally stand on her own. They reached the center of the square, where a large, decorated archway marked the entrance to the festival's dance floor. It was a moment of vulnerability, a space where they were exposed, where their differences were most apparent against the backdrop of the shorter, frailer townsfolk. But Bernadette didn't falter. She took a step toward the archway, her hand still firmly in Thaddeus. Suddenly, a voice cut through the respectful silence like a razor blade. Sharp, familiar, and dripping with a desperate, venomous malice. Well, if it isn't he, the lumberjack, and his heavy-duty mule, come down to remind us all what a lack of breeding looks like. Bernadette froze. Her blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. Standing in the shadow of the general store, his face twisted into a sneer that was more fear than confidence, was Elias Thorne. He stepped into the street, his clothing disheveled, his eyes darting wildly to the crowd, begging for the approval he had lost weeks ago. He had been waiting. He had been nursing his wounded ego, and he had been waiting for the exact moment to strike. The town square shifted. The respectful silence curdled, turning into a tense, vibrating anticipation. All eyes, the townsfolk, the merchants, the children, locked onto the three of them. Elias took a step toward them, his finger pointing at Bernadette. You think you can just walk in here? You think because you rebuilt like a barn door that you belong in polite society? You a debt, nothing more. A property that hasn't paid its due. He glanced at the crowd, desperate to incite the old laughter. Are you going to let these abominations walk among us? Bernadette's heart hammered against her ribs. The old terror clawed at her throat. The instinct to shrink, to hide, to apologize for her existence. But then, she felt the pressure of Thaddeus' hand, warm, solid, and completely, terrifyingly calm. He didn't move to fight. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even look angry. He looked at Bernadette. He looked at her with a calm, inviting trust, as if to say, this is your ground, Bernadette. You stand where you choose. She looked at Elias, this small, bitter, frightened man, and for the first time, she didn't see a master. She didn't see a foreman. She saw exactly what he was, a fragile man who used cruelty to hide his own lack of substance. She took a step forward, towering over him, her shadow falling across his face. Pardon me. Bernadette looked down at Elias Thorne. From her vantage point, he seemed remarkably small, a frantic, agitated creature vibrating with the intensity of his own insecurity. His face was flushed, his bow tie askew, and his eyes darted around the square, desperate for the town to validate his rage. But the square remained deathly still. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a stark contrast to the stale acidic tang of Elias's fear. She felt the old urge to curl inward, to disappear, to become the invisible worker she had been for a decade. But then she felt the heat of Thaddeus' presence at her back. He did not touch her. He did not need to. He simply stood there, an immovable cliff of a man, his very existence a testament to the fact that strength was not a sin. Bernadette took a long, steady breath. She did not raise her voice. She did not use the jagged, angry tone that Elias used. She spoke with a quiet, resonant clarity that carried across the square, hitting the wooden boardwalks with the weight of a dropped stone. "Motem not a debt," she said, the words smooth and firm. Elias recoiled as if she had slapped him. He opened his mouth to retort, to spew another insult about her breeding or her size. But Bernadette continued, her gaze never wavering from his. "Motem not your property to be seized. Motem not a mule to be traded for your comfort. And Motem certainly not a spectacle for your amusement." She took one singular step forward. She was a woman of statuesque, overwhelming presence, and in that moment she owned the space around her. She was not a circus freak. She was a woman who had carved a life out of the frost, and the silence, a woman who had stood between her protector and an avalanche. "You called me a beast," she continued, her voice dropping, becoming a low, commanding hum. "But look at yourself, Elias. Look at the way you stand, trembling before a woman you thought you could break. You are afraid because you realize that your money, your contracts, and your cruelty mean nothing here. You have no power in this valley anymore, and you have no power over me." Elias looked around, his mouth agape, expecting the town to roar with laughter, to back him up, to shove these outcasts out of the square. But the town did not move. The blacksmith who had jeered at her the day she arrived was standing kept his arms crossed, a look of thoughtful, contemplative silence on his face. The woman with the parasol had lowered it, her eyes fixed on Bernadette with a strange, flickering light of curiosity. The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. He had lost his audience. He was just a small man, shouting at a mountain. His face drained of color. He sputtered, turned on his heel, and pushed through the crowd, his gait uneven and desperate. He disappeared down an alleyway, leaving behind nothing but the fading echo of his own insignificance. Bernadette stood in the silence, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked out at the faces of the people who had mocked her. They were not smiling. They were not pointing. For the first time, they were truly seeing her. She turned to Thaddeus. He was looking at her, his expression a mixture of profound unbridled pride and a raw, ache-filled adoration. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply bowed his head, a gesture of absolute, soul-deep respect for the woman who had just conquered the valley, with nothing more than her own dignity. The silence in the square was broken by the sudden, bright, and infectious melody of a fiddle. The festival band, sensing the shift in the air, began to play a slow, sweeping waltz. The crowd began to disperse, the tension of the confrontation dissolving into the lazy, golden afternoon. But Thaddeus remained where he was, his gaze locked onto Bernadette. "The music," he rumbled, his voice barely audible over the scrape of the bow against the strings. "It is a waltz." Bernadette looked toward the small, makeshift wooden stage. The musicians were playing a tune that was old, melodic, and achingly beautiful. It was the kind of song that required two people to hold each other, to move in a circle, to exist within the orbit of one another. Her heart did a slow, heavy roll in her chest. She looked down at her own hands, then up at his massive, broad shoulders. "I do not know how to dance," she admitted, her voice tinged with a sudden, sharp vulnerability. "Mort have never. There was never anyone to hold me." Thaddeus stepped closer, his presence a warm, solid wall against the cool breeze that had begun to drift through the square. He didn't mock her. He didn't minimize her fear. He simply reached out, his massive, calloused hand hovering in the space between them. "Moat do not know the steps either," he confessed, his voice a low, gravelly secret. "But Mott know how to hold my ground. And Mort know how to hold you." Bernadette looked at his hand. It was the hand that had kissed her scars. It was the hand that had held her steady when the avalanche took the shed. It was the hand that had built a home for a woman he hadn't even met yet. She reached out, her massive, trembling fingers sliding into his palm. The contact was immediate, electric, and terrifyingly intimate. The town was still there, the merchants, the farmers, the wandering families, but they suddenly felt 1,000 miles away. Thaddeus guided her toward the center of the wooden floorboards, his steps slow and deliberate. He placed his other hand on the small of her back. The touch was firm, grounding, tough, and possessive in the most gentle, protective way imaginable. Bernadette placed her hand on his shoulder, feeling the thick, powerful muscle beneath the wool of his coat. She felt the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. They stood there for a moment, the fiddle's melody weaving through the air, before they began to move. It was not a graceful dance. They were giants, both of them too big for the subtle, delicate steps of the local elite. They were clumsy, with their movements heavy and hesitant, their boots occasionally clattering against the floorboards. But as they began to sway, a strange, beautiful harmony took hold. They moved as one unit, their bodies pressing together, finding a rhythm that defied the music. It was a dance of labor and of love, of two people who had spent their lives carrying the world and were now, finally, carrying each other. The townspeople stopped their chatter. They watched. They watched the mountain man, the recluse, the giant, moving in a circle with the woman who had arrived as a joke and had stayed to command the mountain. There was no mockery in their gaze now. There was a stunned, reverent silence. They saw the way Thaddeus leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closed, the rest of the world falling away. They saw the way Bernadette held him, her face illuminated by a radiance that could only be born of absolute, earned safety. They were not a joke. They were a force of nature. As they turned, the world blurred at the edges. Bernadette felt the intoxicating, heady rush of being known. She was not the laborer. She was not the anomaly. She was a woman in the arms of the man who had seen her, chosen her, and claimed her. "You are steady," Thaddeus whispered against her temple, his breath warm, his voice a vibration that hummed through her entire being. "So are you," she replied, her voice soft, her heart overflowing with a gratitude that threatened to bring her to her knees. The music swelled, the fiddle rising to a crescendo, the bow moving faster, pulling them into a tighter, more rhythmic sway. But as the waltz reached its peak, a shadow crossed the edge of the floor, a dark, sleek carriage pulled by two black horses, skidding to a halt near the edge of the square. The music continued. But Bernadette felt Thaddeus' body stiffen, his muscles locking, his hand on her back tightening into a grip of pure, protective alarm. He didn't pull away. He didn't stop the dance. But his gaze shifted, his eyes sharpening into predatory focus as he stared at the men stepping out of the carriage. They were not townsfolk. They were not local farmers. They were dressed in tailored suits, their movements precise, a cold and calculated men of the railway syndicate, men who had come to claim the mountain. The lead man, a tall, thin figure with a silver-topped cane, walked directly toward the dance floor, his eyes fixed on Thaddeus with a look of predatory recognition. "Mr. Thaddeus," the man called out, his voice sharp and carrying over the music. "A pleasure to finally meet the man who thinks he owns the earth." Thaddeus slowed, his feet coming to a halt, but he kept his arms securely, defiantly wrapped around Bernadette's waist. He did not let go. He did not look away from the man. The waltz faltered, the music trailing off into a discordant, nervous silence. The entire square held its breath, the air vibrating with the collision of two worlds, the wild, untamed mountain, and the cold, unyielding advance of the valiant ambition. Bernadette stood by his side, her hand still on his shoulder, her heart pounding. She looked at the man with the cane, then at Thaddeus. Would he let go of her to face them? Or would he stay and force them to dance with the mountain? Part Mori High. The man with the silver-topped cane, Sterling, as he introduced himself with a thin, unctuous smile, remained planted in the center of the wooden dance floor. He stood with the effortless, arrogant posture of a man who owned the very air he breathed. Behind him, two associates in dark tailored suits watched with the cold, detached precision of wolves circling a wounded animal. Thaddeus did not move. He did not release Bernadette. He kept his arm firmly wrapped around her waist, his hand splayed against the small of her back, a deliberate, possessive act that signaled to every person in the square that he was not yielding an in. The mountain pass is essential for the future of the rail line, Sir Thaddeus, Sterling continued, his voice smooth and devoid of any genuine civility. You are merely squatting on land that is, quite frankly, far beyond your capacity to manage. It would be unfortunate if a man of your unique physical requirements were to find himself on the wrong side of a legal proceeding. The threat hung in the air, heavy and sharp. It was an invitation to negotiate. It was a declaration of war, the cold, crushing weight of industry against the wild, stubborn silence of the timberline. Bernadette felt the heat radiating from Thaddeus' body. She felt the way his muscles bunched, the way his heartbeat hammered a fast, primal rhythm against her ribs. He was a man who had spent years running from the chaos of the world, and now the chaos had tracked him to the very heart of his sanctuary. "I'm not moving," Thaddeus said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that silenced the nearby merchants. "And am not selling. This mountain has no price." Sterling's smile thinned, showing teeth that looked like slivers of flint. He flicked his gaze toward Bernadette, his eyes tracing the line of her shoulder, the strength of her arm, and the way she stood, unyielding, at Thaddeus' side. "And you, miss?" He paused, feigning a look of confused recognition. "The girl from the docks. Imagine the East would be surprised to find you playing at being a lady on the frontier. Perhaps you would find the reality of your situation much more comfortable if you were to return to where you are understood." Bernadette felt a cold, jagged spike of fear pierce her heart. The mention of the docks, of her past, was a tactical strike. He wasn't just threatening their home. He was threatening her identity. He was trying to push her back into the box of the freakish laborer. She stood taller. She didn't let go of Thaddeus' shoulder. She looked Sterling directly in the eye, her hazel gaze steady and unflinching. "Am where am understood," she replied, her voice ringing out, clear and resonant across the square. "And am not going anywhere." The crowd murmured. The blacksmith, the woman with the parasol, the local farmers. They were watching, their expressions shifting from wary curiosity to something approaching an uneasy solidarity. The giants were standing their ground, not with violence, but with a quiet, devastating grace that made the syndicate men look like intruders in their own town. Sterling's expression didn't change, but his grip on his cane tightened. He realized, with a flicker of annoyance, that he was making the impression he had planned. The giants were not cowed. They were not begging. They were an immovable reality, and the town was beginning to notice. "We shall see," Sterling murmured. turning on his heel with a sharp, dismissive movement. The law is a slow, persistent thing. Mr. Thaddeus, you will find that even the mountains cannot hold back the tide. He walked away, his associates trailing behind him like shadows. The carriage doors slammed, and the black horses pulled them rapidly toward the town's hotel, leaving the square in a stunned, vibrating silence. The music did not return. The festival felt different now. The air was colder, the tension thick and unyielding. But Bernadette didn't let go. She remained in Thaddeus' arms, the connection between them, a lifeline in the face of the encroaching storm. Thaddeus let out a long, shuddering breath, his hand still clamped to her waist. He looked down at her, his eyes dark, filled with a raw, agonizing conflict. He was looking at her as his bride. He was looking at Mutfer as the target of a war he had tried to avoid. "We have to go," he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, desperate urge to shield her from the fire he knew was coming. "We have to go back to the timberline and prepare. Mort cannot let them touch you." Bernadette saw the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. It was the fear of losing the one thing he had finally allowed himself to love. "We are together," she said, her voice firm, her hands finding his face, pressing her palms against the rough, bearded skin of his cheeks. "Wherever we are together." Thaddeus closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, his posture crumbling for just a fraction of a second, revealing the sheer, exhausting weight of his devotion. "Mot never thought," he began, his voice breaking. "Mot never thought Mot would find someone who would stand vacate te hatmi when the world came to break us." "Mot, I'm not going anywhere," she promised, her heart swelling with an intensity that bordered on pain. She loved him. It wasn't a tentative, careful thing. It was a massive, overwhelming commitment, a love forged in the fire of their shared history and tempered by the cold of the mountain. They began to walk toward the wagon, their gaits synchronized, their heads held high. The townspeople watched them, their eyes following the two titans as they navigated the square. There was no more pointing. There was no more laughter. There was only the stunned, respectful awareness of two people who had proven themselves to be made of something stronger than the dirt they walked upon. They were nearing the edge of the square, the horses stamping their hooves impatiently, when a man in a dusty, sweat-stained vest intercepted them. It was the town's telegraph operator, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers and a look of profound, troubled hesitation. He held a yellowed piece of paper, the edges crinkled from being clutched too tight. "Miss Bernadette?" he asked, his voice wavering as he looked from her to the mountain man. Bernadette stopped, her hand instinctively tightening on Thaddeus' coat. A strange, cold dread settled in her gut. "Yes?" The operator extended the paper. "This arrived at the depot just an hour ago. It's marked urgent and addressed to you." Thaddeus' eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to the paper as if it were a bomb. Bernadette reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the sheet. She unfolded it, her eyes racing over the typed, impersonal letters. It wasn't a message from the syndicate. It was a threat from the valley. It was a summons from an estate attorney in Philadelphia. Her breath hitched, her lungs suddenly feeling as if they had been punctured. She reread the first line 3 times, her brain refusing to process the impossible, life-altering words. "Bernadette," Thaddeus said, his voice low, a note of sharp, immediate alarm creeping in as he saw the blood drain from her face. "What is it?" She could speak. She stared at the paper. The world around her, the festival, the syndicate, the mountain, the man she loved, dissolving into a haze of absolute, paralyzing disbelief. The telegram was from the shipping company where she had worked for 10 years. But it was a notice of debt. It was a legal declaration. Through a bizarre, unforeseen chain of events involving a distant relative she had never known existed, a massive, life-changing inheritance had been located in her name. It was an opportunity, a way out, a chance to return to the East, to own a home, to live a life of comfort and safety and wealth, thousands of miles away from the mountain, the syndicate, and the hard, frozen life of a timber workeress bride. It was the normal life she had dreamed of when she boarded the train. She looked up, her gaze meeting Thaddeus's eyes. He was watching her, his face a mask of restrained, agonizing stoicism, as if he were already bracing himself for the moment she would realize she didn't have to stay. "What does it say?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper, his hand on her back, dropping away, as if he were suddenly afraid that touching her would be an act of theft. Bernadette looked down at the paper, then back at the man who had kissed her scarred hands. The wind whipped around them, cold and indifferent, carrying the scent of impending change. She stood at the crossroads of her two lives, the comfort of the unknown future, or the beautiful, brutal, and terrifying reality of the man standing before her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the paper crumpling in her fist. The silence of the mountain began to close in, and for the first time, she was sure if the foundation they had built together was strong enough to survive the temptation of what she had been offered. Part Muriba. The wagon ride back up the mountain was a funeral procession in all but name. The vibrant, golden afternoon had surrendered to a bruised, violet twilight, and the temperature plummeted as they climbed toward the timberline. Bernadette sat rigidly on the bench, the crumpled paper of the telegram pressed so hard against her thigh that the edge dug into her skin, a sharp physical reminder of the life that was suddenly, impossibly dangling before her. Thaddeus held the reins with a grip of iron. His face was a mask of granite, the same stoic, unreadable expression he had worn the day he first brought her up from the valley. He did not look at her. He did not ask her what she wanted to do. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the darkening trail, his jaw set so firmly that the muscles along his throat stood out like taut cables. The silence between them was no longer the comfortable, companionable quiet of shared strength. It was heavy, suffocating, and fractured by the invisible barrier of the news she carried. When they finally reached the cabin, the horses were lathered and exhausted. Thaddeus jumped down, his movements hurried, almost clumsy. He unhitched the team and led them to the stable with a brusque efficiency that left no room for Bernadette to assist. She stood on the porch, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. She waited, her heart thumping a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. She had expected him to ask. She had expected him to fight, to pull her into his arms, to tell her that the money meant nothing, that they were a fortress, that they were a team. But he was acting as if she had already left. When he finally entered the cabin, he didn't head for the fire. He went straight to the small, wooden desk in the corner, his back turned to her. Bernadette walked inside, her boots sounding unnaturally loud on the floorboards. She clutched the telegram, her knuckles white. "Thaddeus," she began, her voice a ragged, uncertain whisper. He didn't turn around. He began to organize his tools, a mindless, repetitive task he performed to keep his hands from shaking. "It's a fortune," he said, his voice flat, stripped of the deep, gravelly warmth that usually colored his speech. Moat saw the name of the shipping firm on the envelope. "That is just a few dollars. That is a life. A life in the city." "Moat never asked for a life in the city," she said, her voice, rising, edged with a sudden, sharp desperation. Thaddeus turned then. His eyes were cold, not the cold of the mountain, but the cold of a man who had decided to bury his own heart to protect someone else's future. He looked at her, his massive frame looming, but his presence felt distant, unreachable. "You don't have to ask," he said, his voice hard. "You spent years looking for a way out of the docks. You spent years being a laborer, being the big girl, being the one everyone looked down on. This telegram. It's the end of all of that. It's the end of the struggle." "And what about us?" she asked, her voice cracking. "What about the mountain? What about everything we built?" Thaddeus stiffened, his jaw tightening. He walked to the center of the room, his movements slow, his eyes avoiding her own. "We built a life out of necessity," Bernadette asked. "We were two people trying to survive in a place that didn't want us. But you don't have to survive anymore. You can live." "Is that what you think Moat want?" she cried, her voice echoing in the rafters. "Do you think Mort want a house in Philadelphia? Do you think Mort want to be a lady of leisure?" "It's what you deserve," he countered, his voice rising, a flash of something like pain crossing his features before he slammed it back behind his stoic mask. "You deserve comfort. You deserve to be seen as a woman, not a worker. You deserve to be surrounded by people who don't treat you like a monster. And you deserve to be safe. Safe from the syndicate, safe from the town, and safe from a life of isolation with a man who has nothing to offer you but cold timber and hard work." Bernadette felt the air leave the room. He was doing it. He was pushing her away, framing his rejection as an act of noble sacrifice. He believed he was nothing to offer, that his love was just another burden she would have to carry, and he was using her inheritance as the perfect excuse to set her free. "You think you reap protecting me by sending me away?" she whispered, her hazel eyes filling with tears. "Mott met giving you a choice," he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register that forbade argument. "And if you stay here, you re-choosing to be a target. You re-choosing to be the giantess bride in a town that will never let you be anything else. Go back east. Find who you are without the shadow of this mountain hanging over you." He turned his back on her again, walking toward the workshop. The door stood open, the room filled with the furniture he had built for her, the rocking chair, the vanity, the bed frame. He looked at Moat Fiat for a moment, his shoulders slumping, and Bernadette realized with a crushing, absolute clarity that he was looking at his own failure. He didn't think he was enough. He didn't think he was the man who could give her what she wanted. And he was too proud, too broken, to ask her to stay. "Moat met leaving in the morning for the supply run," he said, his voice sounding hollow. "Moat Leglunk take you to the station. You can catch the express south." He didn't wait for a response. He walked into the workshop and closed the door behind him, not the iron padlocked door of the past, but the simple, tan, wooden door that now felt like a vault. Bernadette stood in the center of the kitchen, the silence of the cabin roaring in her ears. She felt a profound, devastating rejection. She had come to this mountain looking for a home, and she had found it. Not in the structure, but in the man. And he was trying to give her back the very freedom she had been fighting to relinquish. She walked slowly to their bedroom. She reached under the bed and pulled out her battered canvas bag, the same bag she had brought kept Hatter on the train, the one Thaddeus had carried for her. She began to pack. Her movements were sluggish, mechanical. She folded the linen blouse she had worn to the festival, the memory of his hand on her waist flashing through her mind like a brand. She thought of the dance. She thought of the way he had looked at her, not as a burden, not as a client, but as the only real thing in his life. And now, he was throwing it all away, because he didn't believe he was worthy of it. She closed the bag. It was light. So light, containing only the few items that had mattered before she kept what it felt like to be held. She walked to the window and looked out at the mountain. The peaks were dark, silhouetted against a sky choked with stars. The wind was rising, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to howl for the two of them. She could leave. She could take the train. She could be a wealthy woman in the East, where no one knew about the docks, where no one would stare at her shoulders, where she could live a life of perfect, safe, respectable silence. But as she touched the glass, she felt the cold seep through, and she thought of the man sitting in the workshop, surrounded by the beautiful, massive furniture he had built for a life he didn't think he deserved. She realized then that he was just pushing her away. He was punishing himself. He was keeping her at arm's length, because he believed that the moment he truly allowed himself to need her, he would destroy her. She sat on the edge of the bed, the canvas bag at her feet. She was not a victim anymore. She was not a laborer. She was a woman who knew what she wanted, and she was not going to let him decide her future by acting like a martyr. But he was so stubborn, so immovably, tragically determined to be the hero who sacrificed everything. If she left, she would be playing into the trap he had set for them both. If she stayed, she would have to break through the walls of his guilt. And she was sure if he had any strength left to face the truth. The house was deathly quiet. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing, pulsing embers that cast long, skeletal shadows against the walls. Bernadette lay back on the bed, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. She had until morning. In the workshop, Thaddeus sat in the silence, his hands resting on the arm of the chair he had built for her. He was waiting for the morning, waiting to drive her to the station, waiting to watch the only light in his world walk away and leave him in the dark. He didn't know that she had no intention of boarding that train. He didn't know that she was already formulating a plan to force him to see that he was the only life she wanted. But as the clock ticked closer to dawn, a new, sharp sound broke the silence of the night, not the wind, but the unmistakable, heavy rhythm of footsteps on the porch. They weren't the steady, purposeful steps of Thaddeus. They were frantic, uneven, and desperate. Someone had climbed the mountain in the dark of night, and they were pounding on the cabin door with a terrified, rhythmic urgency. Bernadette sat up, her heart leaping. Thaddeus was already moving, his heavy boots hitting the floor, his hand grabbing the lantern. The war wasn't waiting for morning. The valley had decided that the time for threats was over. Bernadette grabbed her bag, her resolve hardening into a cold, unbreakable diamond. She followed Thaddeus to the door, her hand finding the handle of the iron poker she had used before. If they wanted to take them, they were going to have to get through The two of them, standing side by side. But as Thaddeus pulled the door open, the sight that met them was the syndicate. It was a group of townspeople, led by the blacksmith, and they weren't holding weapons. They were holding lanterns, and their faces were etched with a fear that made Bernadette's skin crawl. Thaddeus, the blacksmith, gasped, his breath hitching, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended the syndicate's greed. You have to help us. They aren't just coming for the land. They breached the dam above the valley. They were going to drown the town. Part muy bon. The night air, once crisp and silent, was suddenly freighted with the heavy, frantic scent of impending doom. The blacksmith, a man whose hands were usually as steady as the iron he worked, gripped the railing of the porch until his knuckles went white. Behind him, the cluster of townsfolk huddled in the lantern light, their faces etched with the terrifying, gray pallor of the condemned. The dam, the blacksmith choked out, his eyes darting toward the high, shadowed ridges above the valley. They blew the drainage spillway to clear the channel for their equipment. But they didn't stop the flow. The basin is flooding, and the concrete is holding for now. But if it breaks, the entire lower valley will be underwater by dawn. Everyone is in the lowlands, the festival grounds, the houses, the depot. They rewrite in the path. Thaddeus stood like a statue carved from the mountain itself. The lantern light threw his features into sharp, dramatic relief, highlighting the sudden hollow emptiness in his eyes. He didn't look at the blacksmith. He looked at the mountain, his mind clearly tracing the geography of the slopes, the fault lines, and the engineering folly that he had warned them about years ago. What told them? Thaddeus murmured, his voice a hollow, haunting echo. What told the council 10 years ago that the geology wouldn't hold the weight of a lake that large? What told them the bedrock was fractured? He turned slowly to look at Bernadette. His expression was not one of rage, but of a profound, devastating resignation. That is how my brother died, Bernadette. He was working the site, trying to brace the foundation. He was the one who saw the shift. He tried to pull the men out, but the shift was too fast. The concrete collapsed, and the earth swallowed him. Bernadette felt the air in her lungs turn to ice. The secret, the tragedy that had defined his life, was not a failure of strength. It was a failure of the world to listen to him. He had just been a recluse, because he was broken. He had been a grieving man guarding the grave of his own kin, watching the valley ignore the very danger that had taken him. You have to come. Thaddeus, the blacksmith, pleaded, his voice breaking. You're the only one who knows how the pressure valves work. You're the only one who knows the mountain's veins. If you don't help us release the pressure before the main wall gives, they all drown. Thaddeus looked at the townspeople, the same people who had mocked him, the same people who had labeled him a savage, the same people who had sided with the syndicate that was now destroying their homes. He looked at the valley below, a sprawling, fragile collection of lives that had treated him as an outcast. He slowly turned to the small, wooden desk in the corner. He opened the drawer, pulling out a heavy, leather-bound journal, his father's records, his brother's notes. He held them for a long moment, then shoved them into his coat pocket. Go back, Thaddeus said, his voice flat, emotionless. Mort will come. But get everyone to the high ridge. Do not wait for me. Thaddeus, the blacksmith, began. But Thaddeus turned away, his movements cold and mechanical. Go. The townspeople retreated, their lanterns bobbing away into the darkness like fleeing fireflies. Thaddeus stood on the porch, his back to Bernadette. He reached out to the latch, his hand trembling, a microscopic, human tremor in the shadow of the man. You stay here, he said, not turning around. You take the train. You take the money. You go. Bernadette didn't answer. She walked to the wall where he kept his heavy, forged steel climbing spikes and his harness. She grabbed it, dapped them, the metal cold and biting in her palms, and walked up behind him. "Motum not a bystander. Thaddeus," she said, her voice rising, steady and firm. "Motum not a decoration you hide when the storm comes. Mot am your equal." He spun around, his eyes wild, his voice raw. "You don't understand. The dam is unstable. If it collapses while we rete hate roe, then we collapse together," she snapped, stepping into his space, her towering frame forcing him to look at her, really look at her. "Mot have spent my whole life being a beast of burden, because Mot thought that was all Mot was. Mot have spent my whole life waiting for someone to give me permission to exist. Mot am not waiting anymore. You are going to save those people because it is who you are, and Mot am going with you because it is who Mot am." She stood there, a vision of fierce, uncompromising strength, her hazel eyes reflecting the dim glow of the dying lantern. She didn't look like a circus freak. She looked like a queen of the wild, her spirit unbreakable, her heart anchored to his, with a ferocity that defied death. Thaddeus looked at her, his jaw working. For a long, agonizing moment, he seemed to be teetering on the edge of an abyss, his pride fighting the undeniable, overwhelming need for the only person who had ever truly seen him. Then, his shoulders slumped, the iron mask he had worn for a decade shattered. He reached out, his massive hands gripping her shoulders, his fingers digging into her coat, pulling her into a hold so tight it bordered on painful. He pressed his forehead against hers, his breath hitching, a sound that was half sob, half prayer. "Mot cannot lose you," he whispered, his voice broken. "Bernadette, Mort cannot lose you." "Then Dante," she breathed, her hands coming up to cradle his face. "Hold me. Trust me. And let us show them why the mountain is worth saving." He pulled back Nath, his eyes dark with a new, terrifying resolve. He grabbed his coat, his axe, and the climbing gear. He looked at her one last time, a look of profound, aching adoration, before he stepped out into the night. They moved through the forest like ghosts, two giants against the encroaching disaster. The descent was treacherous, the trail slick with melting snow, the air screaming with the vibration of the straining dam ahead. The roar grew louder as they approached the base of the ridge, a deep, rhythmic thrum that resonated in their very bones. The spillway was a chaotic, frothing mess of debris and white water, the concrete groaning under the pressure of the rising, turbulent lake behind it. Thaddeus moved to the secondary control station, a rusted, overgrown gate embedded in the rock face that the syndicate had sealed off. He worked with the speed of a man possessed, his massive frame shifting, his hands moving with the delicacy of an artisan. "The pressure is too high," he shouted over the roar of the water. "If we open the gate, the force will tear the lever off. It needs a secondary brace." He looked at Bernadette. He didn't need to explain. They both knew what he needed. A brace. A human anchor. Bernadette looked at the iron lever, a cold, rusted, immovable object that was the only thing standing between the town and oblivion. She looked at the surging, deadly water, and then she looked at Thaddeus. "If Mott hold it," she shouted, her voice cutting through the deluge, "you can work the valve." "It will crush you," he roared, his eyes wide with horror. "It 1T, she countered, her feet planting into the slick rock, her colossal frame bracing against the stone wall. "Mort, I'm stronger than the gate. Just do it." Thaddeus hesitated, his face a mask of agony. He was being asked to put the woman he loved in the path of a monster. But the dam groaned, a sound of structural collapse that made the ground beneath them jump. There was no time. He lunged for the valve, his muscles cording, his power focused entirely on the mechanism. "Ready," he bellowed. Bernadette stepped forward, her massive shoulders hitting the rusted iron of the brace. She gritted her teeth, her hazel eyes blazing, and locked her knees. She felt the weight of the water, the sheer, crushing pressure of the mountain-s agony, pressing against her body. She was a wall. She was a mountain. She was the anchor. "Do it." Thaddeus slammed his weight into the valve, the metal shrieking in protest. The gate shifted. A massive, deafening torrent of water exploded through the channel. A white, frothing tide that threatened to sweep them both off the ridge. Bernadette held. She held against the water. She held against the debris. She held against the very force of the earth. She felt her muscles screaming, her bones straining, but she didn't move. She could move. The water level began to drop. The groaning of the dam slowed, silenced by the release of the pressure. Thaddeus secured the valve, the gear locking into place with a definitive, metallic thud. He spun around, his face white, his chest heaving, searching for her. Bernadette stood in the spray, her blouse torn, her skin mapped with red, angry welts. But she was standing. She was breathing. She looked at him, her lips curling into a triumphant, exhausted smile. But then, the ground beneath the control station, the entire shelf of rock they were standing on, gave a sudden, terrifying lurch. The foundation, weakened by the water and the shoddy syndicate construction, began to shear away from the mountain. Bernadette. Thaddeus lunged for her, his hand outstretched, but the space between them widened as the rock face crumbled into the chasm. Bernadette felt her feet lose purchase. She reached out, her fingers catching his, but the weight of the debris was pulling her down into the darkness of the gorge. She hung there, suspended over the raging, swirling vortex of the spillway. Thaddeus' hand clamped around her wrist with the strength of a dying man. The gorge was black, the water roaring below, and as the ledge continued to crack and fall, Bernadette realized that they were both slipping. "Let go," she screamed, her eyes locking onto his, the fear gone, replaced by a devastating, beautiful peace. "If you don't let go, you'll fall too." "Never," Thaddeus roared, his grip tightening until the skin stretched white over his knuckles, his gaze burning with an intensity that promised he would fight the very earth to keep her. But the rock under his own feet gave way, and they both fell, their hands locked, plunging into the shadows of the mountain-s heart. Part Muyalam. Section Muyalam. The world was nothing but a chaotic, freezing spin of dark stone, white water, and the crushing weight of panic. Bernadette hit the water with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs, the icy current instantly grasping at her limbs, pulling her down into the suffocating depths of the gorge. She tumbled, her shoulder striking a submerged rock, a flash of white-hot agony radiating through her side. She fought the current, her hands clawing for purchase, her lungs burning for air, just as the darkness threatened to claim her. A massive, powerful hand caught the back of her coat. She was hauled upward, the surface of the churning, debris-filled pool breaking, and she gasped in a lungful of frigid, blessedly thin mountain air. Thaddeus was there. He was clinging to the slick, jagged embankment of the gorge, his other arm locked tight around her waist. He was battered, his face streaming vacate hat blood from a cut above his brow. But his eyes, those dark, soulful eyes, were blazing with a single, consuming purpose. "Mote have you," he roared over the thunder of the water. "Mote have you." With a gargantuan heave, he dragged them both onto a narrow, rocky ledge that jutted out just above the swirling froth. They collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving stone, tangled together, shivering violently, their chests heaving in rhythm. Bernadette looked at him, her vision swimming. He was alive. They were both alive. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and traced the line of his jaw. He didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, his head dropping onto her shoulder, a ragged, guttural sound escaping his throat. The sound of a man who had stared into the void and refused to let go of his own heart. The roar of the spillway slowly began to die away. The pressure had been released. The dam was holding. Hours later, as the dawn painted the jagged peaks in soft, bruised hues of purple and gold, the search parties finally found them. The blacksmith led the way, his face pale with relief as he shone his lantern onto the ledge. When he saw the two of them, the mountain man and the woman who had stood against the water, clinging to one another, the light wavered. They were carried down the mountain like royalty. The valley was safe. The houses stood. The depot remained. And the fields were dry. They had been saved by the very people the town had tried to cast out. 2 days later, Bernadette stood on the porch of the cabin. She was bandaged, bruised, and sore, but she felt a lightness in her bones that she had never known. The valley below was alive with the sounds of repair and relief. Thaddeus emerged from the workshop. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, his hands resting in the pockets of his denim trousers. He walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the peaks. "The lawyer sent a messenger," he said, his voice quiet, lacking the defensive edge of the past. "He is waiting in the hotel. He needs your signature. He said the inheritance is yours to claim." Bernadette looked at the paper she held in her hand, the telegram. She didn't feel the pull of it. She didn't feel the phantom weight of the life it promised. She looked at the workshop, the door left open, the furniture waiting to be used. She walked to the hearth, where the fire was crackling with a steady, welcoming warmth. She didn't hesitate. She tossed the telegram into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished into gray ash. Thaddeus watched the fire, his eyes wide. He turned to her, and his breath hitching. "Why?" "Because Motem not a debt," she said, stepping toward him, her towering frame casting a shadow that merged with his. "And Mote am not a property. Mote am a woman who found her home." Thaddeus crossed the floor in 2 strides. He didn't hesitate this time. He caught her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones, his gaze searching hers with an intensity that burned. He didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't offer a disclaimer about his own brokenness. He simply pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was a promise, a claim, an anchor, and a homecoming. The world was vast, and the valley below would always be a place of questions. But here, on the mountain, there was only the truth of the two of them. And so, my friends, the shadows on the mountain lengthen, and the fire in the cabin burns low. You see, the truth of the mountain is not that it is a place to hide. It is a place to be found. Thaddeus and Bernadette didn't change the world overnight. The syndicate eventually left, thwarted by the law and the sheer stubborn resilience of the mountain people. The town of the valley. Well, they learned a lesson that took them a long time to digest. They learned that strength isn't just about what a person can carry, but about the dignity they hold within. Years later, if you were to climb that same high trail, you would find the cabin still standing. The wood is weathered silver, and the porch is reinforced with stone, but it stands, a monument to the life they built together. You would find that the workshop is no longer a place of secrets, but a place of creation. The furniture, the oversized chairs, the sturdy tables, the beautifully carved bed, is worn from use, polished by the touch of people who lived fully, loved deeply, and were never afraid to take up the space they deserved. They lived as they danced, clumsily. Sometimes, but always in step. Always holding hot other against the weight of the world. They were the giants of the timberline, the protectors of the pass, and the quiet, steady heartbeat of the mountain. And if you ever find yourself feeling too small, or too large, or too broken for this world, remember, there is a place for everyone. If only you have the courage to stand your ground and wait for the one who sees you for exactly who you are. Hold your loved ones close. My friends, the mountain is steep, but the view from the top is worth every step of the climb. And remember, sometimes, the greatest strength isn't found in what we can break, but in what we can build together. This story is a work of historical romance fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The characters, settings, and circumstances are products of the author's imagination, and are used fictitiously to explore themes of resilience, emotional healing, and human connection.